Chapter 1147. As far as the eye could see, their vision was almost filled with dazzling lightning. The faces of everyone on the ship were pale. Brendel knew that this was the most critical moment. If they couldn't get through this wave, then all the experience they had gained would be for naught. He turned around and said loudly to the others, "Increase the protection of the law to the maximum. I will take the first hit, but the fleet must at least survive the aftermath of the impact." "No problem." Tada glanced at the overwhelming lightning storm and immediately ordered the others, "Elder of the Mist, Sage of the Frozen Sea, let the sailors blow the horn and increase the protection of the law of the fleet to the maximum." The two elders did not need to be ordered. They also knew whether the fleet would survive or not. This was the most important battle. The password was quickly transmitted to the hearts of every sailor of the Termosian fleet through the mental network. The mental connection of the people of the sea at least played an important role at this moment. The long sound of the horn was heard. The giant oars extended from the sides of the ship and were lowered into the sea formed by the lines of law. A translucent light shield appeared above the dragon-headed warships. If one looked closely, one would find that these light shields were formed by silver lines of law. These lines of law intertwined with each other above the fleet, forming circles of mysterious magic circles. The magic circles overlapped layer by layer, forming a hemispherical shape. In the blink of an eye, the lightning storm at the outermost layer had already arrived. Countless snake-like lightning bolts bloomed from the chaotic storm, flicking their tongues and licking the surface of the light shield. Everyone only heard a series of crackling sounds coming from above their heads, as if their scalps were about to explode. They looked up just in time to see a cluster of dazzling light landing on the light shield. The mast that hung the sail was the first to burst into flames, and then it collapsed with a loud crash, bringing the burnt sail down to the deck. Brando reacted the fastest. He rushed forward with fire and white mist, avoiding the mainmast. Behind them, Fairy and Lute also flew up. They were only swept by the aftermath of the impact and looked a little embarrassed. The two Termosian sages drew a circle in front of them with their stubby fingers, then stepped into it and appeared at the stern in the next moment. With a crack, the mast fell and heavily swept the hull of the ship, causing the entire ship to sway slightly. Brando lifted the canvas and shouted to Aroma, who was not far away. "Now, do it, Aroma." Aroma drew her sword. The holy sword Odorfeis did not have a physical form in her hand, but she was holding a sword made of golden lines of law. The shape of the sword was almost the same as the flaming blade in Brando's hand, except for the more complicated handguard and guard. The archangel did not say a word. Her face was expressionless. In fact, there were no facial features on her ivory-smooth face. She only raised her sword and slashed at the incoming lightning storm. A golden flame rose from the ship. It was hundreds of meters wide and several miles long. It pierced into the center of the lightning storm and collided with countless purple lightning bolts. The center of the lightning storm was hit by a blinding flash. Almost everyone on the ship instinctively closed their eyes. At that moment, it was as if there was a terrible explosion right in front of the ship. The bright light produced by the explosion was so bright that it made people cry even if they covered their eyes with their hands. After a few seconds, Brando, Fairy, and the Termosian on the ship heard a deafening roar in the silence. The roar went from invisible to tangible. Fyeth covered her ears with her hands, and her mouth opened and closed, but no one could hear what she was trying to say. Everyone could only hear one sound, and that was the continuous sound of the explosion. Amidst the strong light and violent airflow, the crew could only feel the ship shaking violently under the impact. They did not know what had happened to Aroma's sword, and whether she had managed to split the terrifying lightning storm apart with a single slash. Only Brando was an exception. In fact, he already knew what the result would be even before Aroma made her move. Besides, even if he did not know, the archangel with the sacred sword would have told him. He could even see that the sword had torn a huge hole in the lightning storm. The two forces that were powerful enough to make all the mortals on Earth look up to collided in the void, and then exploded. A bright wheel of light swept across the void. The energy and wind pressure from the wheel made everyone's hair stand on end. But Aroma could not completely block the massive energy released by the violent magic power. After the purple lightning was torn apart, it continued to sweep towards the ship as if it had some kind of inertia. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation? That's all I can see. Brando thought to himself. He saw that Aroma's body and hands were almost torn apart, and golden flames were spewing out of them. This meant that she had already reached the limit of her power. The archangel with the sacred sword had done her best. The rest would depend on the Termosian's ability. The entire ship shook violently. The 3 ships at the front of the ship instantly turned into flames. The burning debris and sparks flew into the void behind them. As for the passengers on the ships, they had already turned into ashes. Then came the flagship of the port of Everwinter. Brando looked up and saw the scattered lightning bolt colliding head-on with his warship. At that moment the entire ship almost fell apart. The huge inertia almost sent him, who had the physique and strength of a giant, flying from the deck and slamming into the base of the mast. Brando looked at the scene dizzily, but at least he saw one thing clearly. The shield of the ship did not collapse. Although it was almost flattened by the lightning storm, it tried to maintain its integrity. This meant that the fleet had withstood the most fatal wave of impact. Brando quivered and suddenly woke up. He flipped over and bounced up from the deck. With a wave of his hand, the flaming blade automatically flew back into his hand. He held the sword in one hand and rushed to the place where the mast had fallen. He lifted the canvas and rescued Malurcha and the sprite from below. He did not have time to ask about the two's condition. He hurriedly shouted, "Miss Tada, quick, let the ship move in the 7 o'clock direction." Fortunately, the sprite was only a little dazed from the impact. Her somewhat dazed eyes quickly cleared up. She rubbed her forehead and flew up from Brando's hand. She looked at the deck. At this moment, all the Termosians in the ship were in a temporary state of blankness. Some of them had even fainted because they could not withstand the impact. They were scattered all over the deck. Some were trying to get up, while others were looking around in confusion. Without a doubt, the 2 wise men were the first to regain consciousness. The Elder of the Mist was a strong warrior, and it was the least injured in the previous impact. It only fell into a pile of cables, and the soft and tough cables made of sealskin had cushioned the impact on the Elder of the Mist. So it was the first to get up from the pile of people, and ran to the other side to save the wise man of the frozen sea who had fallen into a pile of wooden barrels. Tada was the first to see the 2 wise men and immediately flew over. "My 2 wise men, please immediately let the ships of the Mist Clan and the Frozen Sea Clan follow the ship of the port of Everwinter. Let everyone turn around and move in the 7 o'clock direction," Tada said in a slightly hurried tone. Fortunately, the 2 wise men were the wisest and most experienced in the clan. Of course they knew what to do at this time. They did not hesitate at all and passed down the order. Soon the sound of a horn rang between the ships. Brando heard the sound and rushed to the side of the ship. He watched as the huge ship slowly turned around. The scene in the storm was completely different from what they had seen before. After the lightning flashed, a huge energy turbulence presented a bizarre scene in the void. The sea surface, the path of light, and the lonely reef in the void had disappeared. The ship seemed to be sailing in a boundless universe. Around them were colorful energy storms. Energy, time, and space flowed slowly around the ship. It looked magnificent, but in fact it was the most dangerous thing in the world. If the ship even slightly brushed against it, it would be completely smashed into pieces. Brando knew better than anyone that the Termosian ship was in the center of the storm. The terrifying energy released during the magic transition had disturbed the order of space and time. When the energy swept over the ship, it also pulled the ship into a space-time turbulence. The opening that Aroma had cut open with her sword was the only way for them to escape from this place. But this escape route only existed for a very short time. It could be said that they had to race against time. Otherwise, they would be annihilated by the magic and turned into dust in the void. But the door was not fixed. It also changed any time and anywhere with the flow of magic until it completely disappeared. He was not an expert in this field in the game. He neither had a deep understanding of the magic storm, nor was he an experienced realm explorer. Fortunately, he at least had some experience. He placed his hand on the side of the dragon-headed warship and stared at a layer of colorful energy space. He could see that in the previous impact, almost a third of the huge fleet of Termosian ships had been lost. And these people were not necessarily the last lucky survivors. What he had to do now was to try to let as many people survive as possible. After assigning the tasks, Fairy returned to Brendel's side. She did not say a word as she stood quietly beside Brendel, looking at everything in front of her with sparkling eyes. This was the most dangerous moment, but for those who pursued the ultimate mystery of the world all their lives, this was also the most enchanting scene. Chapter 1148. Both of them were calculating silently. While Tada was calculating, she could not help but look at Brando with admiration. She quickly realized that the direction that Brando had given her might be correct, and she could not be completely sure after careful calculation. Tada could not help but think to herself, what an enviable talent. Unfortunately, Miss Fairy did not know that what Brando was doing now was slightly different from what she had imagined. Calculating the direction of the exit was only the first step. But this was not the most important task. Brando's forehead was soon covered in sweat. Sometimes experience was the best thing to rely on, but sometimes it was not so wonderful to entrust one's life to the experience of others. At least, he only had one thought in his mind now, and that was that the player who had described all this back then had not remembered it wrongly, and had not been bragging. There's an energy vortex on the port side. A voice rang out in the spiritual world. The tone of the Termosian was usually calm, but at this moment, there was a hint of panic in it. Don't panic, Tada ordered calmly through telepathy. However, after she said this, she subconsciously paused. The scariest thing in the energy space was to run into turbulence, but in this place where there was no sense of distance, the space-time turbulence was so unpredictable that it could appear next to you in the next moment. It was impossible to predict. Unless someone completely understands the laws of time and space. Tada did not dare to believe that there might have been strong people in this world who had mastered the elements of time and space, but the power of order that mortals had mastered was only a drop in the ocean of the Tiamat law. The authority that they had mastered was only a tiny part of the truth. Often, mortals would never be able to master the mysteries of the world in their entire lives. Because once someone did this, they would cross the boundary between man and God, perfect their body, ignite their divinity, and become a true god. What exactly was the power of existence? After the gods left, no one knew. But just like how Miss Fairy could not imagine the realm of gods, she could not imagine that someone could travel in such an environment for decades. These people were never afraid of death, because even death could not deprive them of their experience. They were immortal adventurers. They were players. He's here. At this moment, Brando felt his heart skip a beat. His entire body seemed to have relaxed. He lightly breathed in, and issued an order with a resolute tone that even he himself couldn't believe. All ships heed my command. Turn 34 and sail 10 chains in the 9 o'clock direction. Tada felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Not only her, but even White Mist, Lute, and the two Termosian wise men raised their heads subconsciously, as if to confirm if the voice came from the young man. That's impossible, a voice said in Tada's mind. White Mist stared at Brando as if it was staring at the door of a treasure vault that was opening. Amidst the silence, Brando's order was passed down, because no one objected. Perhaps it was tacit approval, or perhaps it had forgotten. Or perhaps all the Termosians were used to subconsciously obeying the orders of the planeswalker. In short, the entire fleet slowly turned once again under Brando's command. It was so clumsy and slow, as if it would crash into the wall of storm the next moment due to its stiff movements and turn into dust in the void. But it did not. Every time, the fleet narrowly avoided the energy and space-time turbulence at the most critical juncture, as if they had already expected the dangerous trap to be there and were prepared in advance. There was no sound in the Termosian mental network for a while. Only Brando's orders were passed down one after another. Turn 76. Raise the sails. Turn 3 chains in the 12 o'clock direction. Turn 44. Turn back to the previous route. Let the fleet behind follow. Continue to sail 7 chains. As if under a spell, the Termosians mechanically carried out the orders like marionettes. Only the occasional shout of the lookout at the bow of the ship could be heard. There's energy turbulence on the starboard side. It's coming. It's 1 chain 30 meters away from us. It's really coming, Lord of Elements. The fleet suddenly shook slightly. At that moment, Tada felt her heart clench. Brando was no better than her. His forehead was covered with fine beads of sweat. He knew in his heart that this was the most critical part. The energy gap was just ahead, but it was hidden in the turbulence of space-time. The huge fleet had to pass through it. Whether the experience of the self-proclaimed veterans was useful or not depended on the last few seconds, although from the previous performance it did seem to be a little useful. But Brando knew that in fact there were several times when things almost went wrong. If it were not for Iroma who continued to help him maintain the Eye of Precepts, the fleet would have suffered heavy losses, although not all of them would have been wiped out. The sea of magic was ever-changing, and the experience of the players was not necessarily reliable at all times. In fact, he knew that the players who relied on these strategies to travel outside the elemental barrier in the Amber Sword were all experienced veterans. But even so, they often failed miserably. The difference was that they could afford to lose, but he could not. Brando's palms were full of cold sweat. It was not that he was not confident enough, but which player who could reach the elemental barrier was not an elite. At least he himself was not qualified to be a member of the Adventurers Club. Even those people could not do it with certainty. He was not sure if he could succeed in one try. In fact, he was already praying to the gods and Lord Martha in his heart. Space-time fault. There was a sudden scream from the bow of the ship. Brando watched as the two dragon-headed warships suddenly twisted there, and the whole ship seemed to be stretched infinitely, and then disappeared in an instant, as if it was sucked into a space that could not be seen with the naked eye. Brando immediately felt a slight pain in his arm. He looked down and found that Miss Tada was sitting on the back of his hand, and her small palm and fingernails almost scratched into his flesh. However, this pain woke him up. The space-time fault was too close and it was impossible to completely avoid it. He only hesitated for a moment, then ordered in a deep voice, "Don't turn, maintain the course and rush forward." No one questioned, and the whole fleet sailed straight ahead in a strange silence. It soon brushed past the space-time fault, and one by one, the dragon-headed warships disappeared from everyone's sight. But no one made a sound in the mental network. Half of the fleet was almost slowly disappearing. Brando backhanded the flaming blade on the deck, then took out the dimensional hole, poured the things inside on the deck, and then handed it to Iroma. He looked at the latter. The angel with the holy sword also looked at Brando. "I'll leave it to you." Iroma nodded. She picked up the dimensional hole and flew out to the starboard side of the fleet. Under everyone's gaze, she caught up with the dragon-headed warships that were twisting and stretching in that direction, and then the figure of the archangel with the holy sword began to distort abnormally under the influence of the space-time fault. But at this moment, everyone suddenly heard a low muffled sound, as if something was broken, and then a dazzling brilliance exploded like the birth of the universe. In an instant, everyone's vision was only left with a vast expanse of white, and the pure and flawless light extended in all directions until it covered the entire space. Then there was a heavy shudder from the Termosian ship. When they came back to their senses, they were surprised to find that the original huge storm vortex had once again appeared in their vision. It was slowly rotating on the left side of the fleet, but near the storm vortex, the previous terrible lightning storm had weakened at this moment, and the surrounding magic storm seemed to have eased, causing a strange calm to appear in the void. In this calm there was no more chaotic and violent magic, only an endless aura of order. Pada. Loot fell on the side of the ship. Brando also stood by the side of the ship in a daze, looking at everything in front of him, and the ecstasy of surviving a disaster could not help but rise spontaneously in his heart. It was not just him. The sailors and seafarers of the three clans were still in a dream until the shaking of the hull began to gradually weaken, and then they seemed to wake up from the dream and burst into a tsunami of cheers. This kind of emotion shared through the mental connection, the relief and joy of surviving a disaster, when they were superimposed on each other, it could not help but make Brando feel proud. He did it. He would also do it. "Mr. Brando." The fairy looked at him with disbelief. "Do you know, I am now very sure that you must be the hope that Martha gave us. You must be that person." Brando lowered his head and looked at the fairy. "Maybe." He took a breath and replied softly. "But no matter what, I will do my best." "Yes," Tada said softly. "We will be with you, we will fight side by side with you, Lady Martha will protect us. Protect us all." P.S. Brando, who pretended to be a fraud once again, begs for monthly vote. Chapter 1149. While the two were talking, Faya suddenly interrupted. My lord, is Lady Aroma all right? She's fine. Brando turned his head and glanced at the little sprite on Malurcha's head. When there's a chance, I'll make her come back. I understand, just like Lord Malurcha and I, right? Brando nodded. Faya's eyes sparkled and she said, oh, with admiration. She probably thought that Brando bringing her and Malurcha back to life was probably the greatest thing in the world. Miss Tata seemed to remember something and asked, Mr. Brando, did you destroy your own dimension hole earlier? Brando was troubled by this matter. On one hand, he felt a little guilty about Aroma. On the other hand, the things poured out of the dimension hole filled the deck. Mainly holy water, all kinds of alchemy potions, scrolls, and the glass sword he had obtained earlier. Of course, the most valuable thing in here was probably a few god-slaying magic-breaking alls. This was the result after he left the remains of the armor and weapons he found in the loop of trade winds in Valhalla. Otherwise, this small deck might not have been able to fit them all. Yes, annihilating the dimension hole will create a spatial fault. This is the only way I can think of to stop the spatial fault from advancing, he replied. Fortunately, Martha blessed me. I was worried that the dimension hole was too small for it. The sprite was slightly touched. She had learned about Brando from the Elven Queen, and had some understanding of the latter's situation. She knew that the dimension hole was a very precious treasure in the mortal world, and Brando was just a noble lord on the border of the civilized world. Although the Elven Queen had mentioned that he was the grandson of Sword Saint Darius, sword saints were not rare in the elemental plane. A mortal sword saint could not possibly be that rich. She also remembered the Elven Queen telling her and Eloranta about the young man in front of her borrowing the dragon's orb from the elves. If he even needed to borrow something like that, it was obvious that the latter was poor. No wonder Mr. Brando was interested in such a lousy item when he traded with us, she thought to herself. On the surface, Miss Fairy's expression was as usual and she did not say a word, but her little heart was slightly melancholy. It was such a person who was willing to give up the most precious treasure to save everyone at the critical moment. She felt her nose tingle slightly. It was like a rich man and a beggar both donating a copper coin. The two approaches might not be better, but the latter was often more touching. Of course, she did not know that Brando was far from a proletarian fighter in wound. At the very least, he had nothing to do with poverty or lack of money. All in all, the huge difference in value and wealth between elementals and mortals created a wonderful misunderstanding at this moment, making Brando's image in Miss Fairy's heart become incomparably lofty. She was even full of sympathy. In fact, with Miss Fairy's current state of mind and knowledge, even if she really saw Brando's warehouse in Abe's castle full of gold, silver, and jewels, of course, most of them were the property of the Roman lords and the public property of the territory, she would probably be full of sympathy. This kind of mentality was probably similar to when we saw ragged barbarians treat shells and glass as treasures. She could not help but subconsciously have such a thought. How pitiful, they don't even know what real wealth is. If this kind of mentality was mixed with some affection for the latter, it would not be surprising that it would evolve into sympathy and pity. Miss Fairy thought for a moment, reached her hands behind her neck, and untied a leather rope from there. She picked up the leather rope and held it in front of Brando with both hands, saying, Mr. Brando, please accept this. What is this? Brando looked at the thing in Miss Fairy's hand. It was a necklace. At the end of the leather rope was a very small crystal ball about the size of his little finger. There seemed to be something in the crystal ball, but it was too small to see clearly. This is the floating sphere, the masterpiece of the dazzling light people, Tata replied as she put the item in his hand. Like all magic items, this necklace could automatically adjust its size according to its owner. Soon it enlarged to about the size of a pigeon's egg in Brando's hand. Only then did Brando see the thing in the crystal ball clearly. It was a piece of soil covered with moss. It was suspended in the middle of the crystal ball, and there seemed to be a miniature landscape above the moss. But he did not notice this at all. His attention was all attracted by Miss Tata's words. This is the floating sphere? Brendel could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. The celestial sphere was a subdivine artifact. What was sealed in the celestial sphere was not a miniature landscape, but a real continent. Among the most legendary half-plane fragments of Vaunt, A few were sealed in such a celestial sphere. Not only were there continents, but there were also living beings and societies. The legendary Lich Adin had such a floating sphere. The continent in the floating sphere was called the Last Holy Realm. There were several kingdoms on the continent, and hundreds of thousands of mortals lived there. The floating sphere was of a much higher level than the dimensional hole. The dimensional hole was just a dimensional fragment, but the floating sphere sealed a real half-plane, the world fragment. Previously, when he asked Aroma to take the dimensional hole to detonate the dimensional fault, if he had used the floating sphere, he was afraid that even a corner of the shallow sea would have collapsed. Fortunately, the law of the floating sphere was very stable. As the most legendary race of craftsmen, the divine artifacts and lesser divine artifacts they made were very reliable. This is too valuable, Miss Tada. Brando suddenly felt that the crystal ball in his hand was a little hot. It's okay. You saved all of us. We can't let you suffer for nothing. Besides, if you are the king that Lady Martha has promised, we will all be your followers. Tada could not help but sympathize with him when she saw him like this. Mr. Brendel was such a simple person. Even a small celestial sphere could be considered as a precious item. And this floating sphere isn't our best demi-plane fragment. If there's a chance, I'll give you my leaf crown vein. There's a complete tree of life in that demi-plane fragment. It'll be of great help to you. This is not our last half-plane. Leaf crown vein. Complete tree of life. Brando was suddenly bombarded by a series of terms that left him speechless for a long time. He finally understood the gap between his knowledge and the other parties. No wonder the White Mist said that he was blind and got a bunch of rubbish after the deal with the Termosai people. It was not that the White Mist's standards were too high, but that he was too country bumpkin. After figuring this out, Brando silently kept his mouth shut and accepted Miss Tada's gift. The Mist Elder and the Wise Sage of the Frozen Sea naturally also expressed their gratitude. The two Termosai elders looked at Brando with a gaze that made him feel a little uncomfortable. If they had eyes, they each gave him a lot of gifts. One of them was the Angel's Heart Bottle. This was one of the most powerful recovery items in the Amber Sword. Of course, this was a title given by the players. In fact, it was just a mythical item. The milky white bottle was said to contain the tear of an angel. As long as the bottle was worn, it would continuously heal the wearer's wounds. The recovery rate was about 1,000th of one's HP per second. In other words, if a dying person wore this holy item, it would take less than 20 minutes for them to be fully recovered. Of course, the Angel's Heart Bottle would only heal the wearer's HP, but it would not heal serious wounds such as broken limbs. But as if taking this flaw into consideration, the archangels who made this mythical item gave it another miracle. Once a day, as long as the wearer drank the tear of an angel in the Angel's Heart Bottle, the wearer would be fully recovered. Of course, resurrection was a little exaggerated, but full recovery was not a joke at all. It would remove all abnormal statuses and heal all injuries, including broken limbs. Of course, the injuries had to be sustained on the same day. Old disabilities were not within the healing range of the Angel's Heart Bottle. Otherwise, this thing was almost equivalent to a moving fountain of youth. After the Angel's Heart Bottle was used, it would lose all its power and become an ordinary crystal bottle. It would not be refilled until the next day and recover its power. The description of this holy item was also very interesting. There was a sentence engraved on its metal ring called "Full of Hope." Brando always felt that this holy item was given by the Mist Elder because of the disdainful tone of the Mist Elder after seeing his holy water. The Mist Elder's thoughts at that time were probably, "These things are not worthy of His Excellency, the King of the Earth. Only a few bottles of number 2 holy water could fight." Brando felt like crying but had no tears. The wise man of the Frozen Sea gave him the treasure of Anvaranoth, the King of the Rings. The players called it the One Ring because of the curse power it carried. He also told him that the World Tree's root could counter the curse on the ring. But it was not only because of the World Tree's root, but also because the World Tree's root was the thorny laurel of the King of the Wound. In other words, this ring was actually a symbol of the King of the Wound. Brando felt a little ashamed. It was not that Miss Tada and the wise men of the Termosian people were country bumpkins, but that he was too ignorant. Chapter 1150. He put on the ring and the Angel's heart vase, and used the floating sphere to collect the items on the deck. Unfortunately, Most of the holy water was thrown away by the Termosai people as trash. The reason was that the Termosai's guest, a planeswalker, would not use such a cheap item. The Termosai elders, on the other hand, praised the soul-stealer bow. It seemed that the elementals did not have any prejudice against demonic items. After doing all this, Brando suddenly felt a lot more confident. After all, he had several divine artifacts, subdivine artifacts, and mythical items. Although it might not be much outside the elemental barrier, he could definitely be considered a tycoon in Wonde. Mr. Brando. Lute, the fire fairy prince, appeared beside him and said, "I also want to give you a gift." Brando was stunned. He was about to open the battle log to see if there was a large amount of magic that was jumping to a lower level near the center of the vortex. This was also the so-called experience points. At this time he had to stop and look at Lute. He noticed that this Forsythian was looking at him with a burning gaze. He could not help but feel a little strange. Miss Tada and the Termosai elders had a good impression of him. One reason was that he might be the so-called chosen one of Martha, but the main reason was that he had saved the entire IC clan and showed his ability to win their trust. That was why they were on good terms with him. Just like before, the people of Roas might have believed that he was the king of the earth, but they were not willing to be with the other clans. After all, prophecies were not something that could be eaten for a living. So, what did this little fire elemental intend to do? It was said that the fire fairies were not rich. He could not help but think of the customs of the 4 elemental worlds that Miss Tada had told him. Lute bowed to him, and the cold and arrogant expression on his face loosened a lot. "I want to introduce myself to you. I want to finish the rest of the journey with you. I, the chosen one of the Flaming Blades, hope to be by your side in the future." Wait, Brando thought. This should be considered an oath. But this kind of oath made him feel a little strange. Lute was a real prince, and if he said that he was a princess, well, that would not be too good. In short, Brando was now confused. He asked, "You want to find the Flaming Blades with me?" More than that, Lute shook his head. "To be precise, I want to fight by your side, the chosen one of the Flaming Blades." "Why?" "Of course, to defeat the Twilight Dragon." "You are so sure?" "I'm not afraid of sacrificing myself for this, Mr. Brendel." "But..." Brendel scratched his head in annoyance. He glanced at his battle record panel, and as he expected, it was flooded with green words. In the battle log, pages of records flowed down like a waterfall. The green words were all notifications of the countless experience points gained. He could even hear Andesha and some Termosians exclaiming not far away. Of course, the latter was in the telepathic link. The power of the magic tide had arrived. In this place closest to the center of the storm, even these people of order could feel their strength increasing rapidly. This experience was not only the filling of magic, but also the understanding of order and law. Because of the law of Tiamat, the whole world was clearly presented in front of everyone like a big open book. Except for the illiterate. This is the center of the storm. White Mist was talking to Malurcha. "I can clearly feel the law of Tiamat. It is here. I didn't expect that the violent energy storm outside was caused by the changes here." "But how does his lordship know all this?" "I think it is his first time here." "Do you know how the first generation of ancestors passed on their wisdom, Malurcha?" "Forgive my ignorance, Lady White Mist. It's said that the wisdom born from fire is innate. All things are bestowed with wisdom by fire, but knowledge already exists in the darkness. The Pale Poem was born from fire, and Marcia also chose that person from fire. His lordship is indeed special. I have a feeling that he may not be from our world." Hearing this, Brando could not help but shiver. He quickly gathered his thoughts, afraid that something would be seen on his face. In fact, Lute was also looking at him with bright eyes. The Fire Fairy Prince asked, "But what is it? Are you saying that I am not good enough for you?" Brando almost choked on his own saliva. He hurriedly stopped the little fairy's next words, afraid that the more he spoke, the more ridiculous it would become. These words were so déjà vu that he could not help but have an illusion that this guy was going to reveal his true feelings. No, Lute, that's not what I meant. I am saying that I agree to go with you to find the Flame Scepter, but as for what happens after that, shouldn't you be more careful?" "But I have already thought about it," Lute replied. I recognize you as the Flame Blade's adorer. I believe that you are the one who can inherit the will of the Golden Flame. The residents of Phorcyides can only have one follower in their lifetime. The fire elementals will follow their protector, and I will follow you. What's wrong with that? He said proudly. Unless you think that I am not qualified, I will not question your decision. But only death can wash away this shame. Mr. Brando, Tata flew over and explained. This is the oath of the Golden Flame. It is the most solemn oath the fire fairies make in their lives. They will only follow those who have truly gained their recognition. This is the highest respect. Brando turned around and looked at the little fairy seriously. Should I agree to it, Lute? It is up to you to decide. I can't just watch you die, right? Brando thought to himself. The fairies might not think that it was wrong, and some human kingdoms like to do it as well. But he could not accept it. Although honor was important, the price of life was not low. He respected those who sacrificed their lives for their ideals, but he could not help but feel that this was making a mountain out of a molehill. But he also knew that this was the real reason why the people of Phorcyides were different from other fairies. He nodded silently and said, Tonajal always welcomes guests. Lute, however, had a very solemn look on his face as he bowed deeply to him. The fire fairies and their followers were equals. They would sacrifice everything for the sake of loyalty and friendship. But if their followers did something disappointing, they would also leave quietly. Tata supplemented Brando's knowledge in a timely manner. But at this time, Brando heard White Mist's voice in his mind. You mean I still have to live with this damn flame mosquito from now on? What can I do? Brando replied innocently. Let him bleed on the spot. Death is not to be regretted. White Mist snorted and did not answer. Although she spoke in a gloomy and terrifying manner, she was actually as soft-hearted as most women. Brando could finally put an end to this troublesome problem. He knew that the fairy was not here to help him, so he quickly turned around and asked, Miss Tata, what happened? Tata nodded and said, It's nothing serious, Mr. Brando. Just as you expected, we have reached the center of the vortex. It's very calm here, and the magic energy is very rich. The previous losses of the fleet are nothing compared to this. But there are some signs of abnormal magic activity in the center of the vortex. I think there might be some creatures hiding in there. You mentioned earlier that if we found any creatures, we should inform you in advance. When Brando heard this, he could not help but straighten up and put the previous matter to the back of his mind. The first thing he thought of was that there were indeed creatures here. It was impossible for there to be no creatures in a place rich in magic energy. Those creatures came from the Sea of Magic, and were one of the most primitive magical creatures in the world. But that was not the main point. In the Amber Sword, after the arrival of the Mana Tide, the player's EXP for killing monsters increased by 3 to 5 times. Compared to the temporary effect of the Mana Tide, this increase was permanent. And here, at the center of the Mana Tide, the place closest to the Law of Tiamat, how much would the EXP for killing these primo in the Mana Tide increase? 20 times? 30 times? Or even more? Brando did not dare to imagine. But this was also the question he was most concerned about. It was not easy to get through the storm, even sacrificing Iroma and the Dimensional Cave, all for this moment. He wanted to become stronger, and it would depend on whether these primo would be effective. There are magical creatures? His voice unnaturally raised a little. Have you found them? On the left side of the fleet, hidden behind a cloud of magic power, Tata replied. But the creatures that live in places rich in magic power are usually primo species that live on magic power and energy. They may be magic creatures, dusk species, or even ether predators. Are we really going to take the initiative to attack them? Of course, Brando answered firmly, but he still added, can we deal with them? Now that he had lost Iroma, his tone was not so sure. After all, the fairy was right. How could something that could survive in such a place be easy to deal with? But at this time, the voice of the Termosian elder, the elder of the Mist clan, interrupted the conversation. The Termosians are the best hunters in the shallow seas. There is no prey that we cannot deal with. But Sir Planeswalker, are these prey valuable? Hearing this answer, Brando smiled. I promise you, he said, they will be the most valuable prey you have ever caught, and may even be the most valuable prey you have ever caught. Then I shall keep their heads as the greatest honor in my life as a hunter." The Elder of the Mist laughed. He then turned to Miss Sprite and said, "Miss Tata, listen to His Excellency the King of the Earth's command. Have the ships turn around." Tata nodded without hesitation. Chapter 1151. This was the shallow gray bay. A fleet of ships was anchored quietly in the mist. The slender silhouette of the dragon-headed warship could be vaguely seen behind the mist, undulating in the waves. The waterlogged timbers were covered with crisscrossing scars, and some of them still had sharp teeth that could not be removed in time. The ship's song of the Termosai came faintly from the mist. It was a song that came from the soul, echoing an ancient tune. It was as if another legendary sea race had come from the sea through time. In the waist-deep seawater, they dragged their heavy prey onto the beach with ropes made from the skin of sharp seals. The largest of them was a squid that was almost as big as a boat and several stories tall. It lay weakly on the beach, its dozens of tentacles full of sharp teeth no longer so threatening due to dehydration. Its soft skin had also dried up, and the huge eyeballs in its eye sockets protruded, making it look like the carcass of a sea monster that had died on the beach for several days. But this was an ether predator, the descendant of Tunglamo. It was not the largest prey that the hunters of the mist had ever caught, but it was definitely the most valuable prey. It provided as much as 133 times, or 134 times the experience, for a total of 27. 4 million experience points. Brando looked up at the huge creature. It and the surrounding Termosai formed a very unreal picture. A picture that was both magical and primitive. It was as if he saw the mythical sea people hunting on the ice sea. Those brave and cold Viking pirates who sang the ship song, carried magic spells and ran in the forest to hunt. This was a race that was sometimes barbaric and sometimes elegant. He could still clearly remember when the lightning beam from the dragon-headed warship hit the monster's skull and opened a crack there. A strong magic storm erupted in the void where the vortex was, causing the strength of the entire fleet to increase by more than 10%. Furthermore, the experience it had gained had directly pushed it to the extreme realm, and this did not include the experience it had automatically absorbed from the void. He gently stretched out his hand, and the ivory planes appeared in his field of vision. Countless laws intertwined in front of his eyes. Although they were silent, they desperately wanted to express their meaning. And the process of mortals understanding them was the process of them experiencing the planes. The gods had attributed the truth to this place. A mortal picking up knowledge from the planes was like picking up shells from the vast sea. What he could obtain in the end depended on what he wanted to obtain. These truths and laws were what he knew. His ideal kingdom, which was stable and inviolable. Only those who could truly gain something from it could be called a sage. This was a genuine Lemiter. It was completely different from the feeling he had obtained with the help of the flaming blade. In other words, when he held Holy Sword Odorfice again, he had already faintly touched the threshold of the peak supreme class. This was also because his understanding of the laws could not keep up with the growth of his strength, because from the experience that Brando had gained, it was more than enough to enter the realm of the sage. But once one entered the realm of elemental mastery, the law would always be the first rein that bound power. If a mortal crossed the line, they would sink into the magic power and become a monster that could not control themselves. It was similar to the tragedy of the Bronze Tribe. However, Brando would not be able to repeat this tragedy, because when he leveled up the Templar Knight and the Frostborn Guard to level 50, the EXP points had completely turned gray. Even the Elementalist and the Scholar could not be leveled up anymore. Obviously, the system strictly guarded this point, afraid that he would cross the line. Bran wasn't too surprised about that because the experience was the same as in the game. At this point, the natives had to understand the laws. Players could not understand the law, so they had to do the promotion quest, the Sage's Proof quest. This quest required them to collect the Philosopher's Stone. It was not a quest that could be completed overnight. The former was also illusory, and no one knew how long it would take. The last mortal with a similar experience was born more than 1,200 years ago. Currently, there was only one sage left in Wound. The Misty Elder looked at its prey with some pride. Brendel was right. This was probably the most valuable prey that it had ever hunted in its entire life, and it was even capable of hunting. It was strong, perfect, and a beautiful prey. Its law of engulfment was also very powerful. But these were not the key points. This prey contained an incredible amount of magic power. It was thousands or even tens of thousands of times richer than the magic power in the bodies of the magic creatures they had captured in the shallow sea. This was simply a miracle. In return, Brando gave the Misty Elder the right to dispose of this prey. The Misty Elder had decided that when they returned, it would always be placed in the most conspicuous place of the fleet. It would be best if it could be made into a statue on the bow of the ship. This would be one of the most glorious deeds of the Misty Elder. The Icy clan were mainly craftsmen, and they would get the most valuable parts of the corpse. Everyone was happy, and the journey was not only filled with sadness and tears. In fact, although the Termosian fleet had lost nearly half of its fleet, and the Longtooth clan had been completely wiped out, because of Brando's final decision, their strength was not reduced by much. All the clans had gained a lot from this journey. Adventurers in the shallow sea did not care about life and death. The meaning of their lives had been shown in the process of sailing in the wind and waves. When the Termosian people played a melodious tune with their bone flutes to bury the souls in the sea, no one was very sad. At most, they were a little serious. This attitude of the Eternal People was something that Brando and the Misty Elder could not understand. "Mr. Brando, we can only send you here. This is the edge of the mountain of ceasing storms, but there is no concept of space here, so you may only be one step away from the Dragon Queen and the Scepter of Flames," Tada said respectfully to Brando, while the Termosian people stood behind her. Unlike Brando, they were about to embark on their journey back. Brando knew that they would pass through the gray section on their way back. Unlike when they came, it would be a dangerous journey. "What I want to say is that you will always be the most distinguished guest of the port of Everwinter. One day you may even become its master. I believe that you will be recognized by Cinna and become the true king of the shallow sea. The Icy clan also welcomes you, Sir Planeswalker," the wise elder of the Icy said. "Same for the Misty Elder." The Misty Elder followed closely behind. Brando nodded to them. No matter what, this experience was worth remembering. Just like how he would always remember that a Termosian clan had sacrificed everything for him. Their bones might be buried in the turbulence of space and time, but their names might disappear in the shallow seas. But in his heart he would always remember them. Please take care of yourselves, everyone. The Termosian people's mental network was filled with blessings, especially from the Icy clan that Brando had once saved. Many people knew what kind of journey this young man was about to embark on. When he turned around, it could be the beginning of a new legend, or it could be the end of the world. But no matter what, it meant that it would be difficult for them to see each other again in the future. For many of the people present, this farewell might be an eternal farewell. Brando saw Elder Keb waving his short, chubby hand at him in the crowd with human etiquette. He smiled and waved back at the somewhat cute Termosian people. "See you again if we have the chance." He took one last look at the short, chubby people of the sea, and at the fleet that was faintly discernible in the sea fog. He took Malurcha and the little fairy Fayaz and turned to leave the beach. Andesha and Lute followed behind him. The latter was far away from the white fog, and the patriarch of the tree herders walked uncomfortably between the two of them. At the same time, he had to endure the angry glares of both sides. Tada looked at this group of people, as well as the back of the tallest person in the group, as if she was looking at a hero. But Mr. Brando is actually more suited to be a scholar. Unfortunately, this is not a choice for us. The fairy looked at Brando and Malurcha's backs as they walked further and further away in the thin fog. She couldn't help but think so. With that, she turned around and said to Elder Keb not far away, "If we don't come back in this battle, you will be the next wise man of the port of Everwinter." Elder Keb looked at the fairy and nodded solemnly. This was the shallow gray bay. The wilderness gave birth to a strange landscape of jagged rocks. Stone pillars that looked like blades surrounded the bay. The sea breeze would occasionally pass through the cliffs and blow away the fog, leaving traces on the pale beach. Brando grabbed a handful of gravel and let it fall through the gaps between his fingers. The sand gave off an unnatural glass-like color. Beside him stood Malurcha, while Fayaz and White Mist were on Mr. Stag's back. The former was chattering away while the latter was actually being nice to her, explaining things to her from time to time. Lute sat on Brando's shoulder. The fairy prince did not smile at White Fog, Fayaz, or Andesha. Only Malercha could make him speak. He had a serious little face, as if he did not care about anyone, but he only listened to Brando. Brando was now at the highest point of the bay. When he looked back, the bay where the ship was only a small dot in the fog. He did not know if the ferry and the Termosi had already weighed anchor and returned, but he could not help but feel a little empty in his heart. Although he had not spent much time with these people, he had experienced more than a normal person would in a lifetime. Then he heard the sound of a horn piercing through the fog. There were 3 horns in total, and they traveled from far to here, as if paying respect to him. Oh! Chapter 1152. Listening to the long sound of the horn coming from behind the mist, Brando let out a long sigh. He didn't say anything. He just turned around silently, leaving the long sound of the horn behind him, and walked down the dune. Malercha also turned his head to take a look. Then he strode forward to catch up. Behind him, Fyeth finally shut her mouth. White Mist looked at the little guy in surprise. She wondered what kind of power could make a fairy become silent. "Will we go back?" Fyeth asked. "Maybe." White Mist was stunned for a moment, and finally understood what the little guy was worried about. But after today, everything may change beyond recognition. If we can defeat the Twilight Dragon when we return to the shallow sea, what we see may not be what we see today. Time never turns back. If you leave your hometown, you will never be able to go back, Malercha said emotionally. He remembered the time when he left the shallow sea. When he returned after thousands of years, the people he saw were no longer the familiar faces. Sigh. Fyeth sighed. Even the usually optimistic little fairy was a little sad. For a moment, the atmosphere of the whole team was a little gloomy. But fortunately, she quickly recovered and threw her previous melancholy to the back of her mind. "But we will always make a lot of new friends, won't we?" Lute, who was sitting on Brando's shoulder, looked at her like she was an idiot. "Speaking of which, why did you think of this?" White Mist asked Fyeth curiously. In her opinion, this little fairy was a heartless character. It was rare to see her focus on something. "I miss Miss Tada a little," Fyeth thought for a moment, then answered seriously. "Miss Tada?" White Mist was surprised. "Madame Tilius, do you like her a lot?" "That's not it." Fyeth shook her head like a rattledrum. "I just feel a little close to her, like she's a twin born from the same seed as me. You humans don't know this feeling very well. For example, I feel like she's my elder sister." "I am not a human," White Mist corrected her. But Malercha almost lost his footing. He paused for a moment before continuing to walk forward. Brando, who had been silent all this time, turned to look at his summoned creature and gave it an encouraging look. Only then did the latter feel a little better. Brando knew that Malercha must have thought of Miss Tada's sister again, that fairy called Rose. Some memories were so profound that you would never be able to forget them, whether it was before or after death. At this moment he couldn't help but think of some distant memories. It was still in the forest of Bucci. The bonfire that was dancing was the gaze of a true knight. Although it had died a long time ago, it had never let go of its obsession with its motherland. It wasn't until a very long time later that this obsession turned into a painful torment that gnawed at its soul day and night. It turned into a sword and protected a kingdom. He also thought of the experience of fighting side by side with everyone in the Amber Sword. It was a journey of laughter, sadness, achievement mixed with tears. The ending wasn't perfect, but it wasn't completely useless. At least this dream reappeared in his heart, making it no longer seem like a simple game. And he was considered lucky compared to Ebden. He was able to be in a dream, or perhaps it was his own dream. Brando sometimes wondered if he had died. His experience at this moment was just to make up for the regrets in his heart. But he was able to regain everything he had lost in this dream. He changed the fate of many people and prevented many destined tragedies from happening again. Although Won's history was falling apart before his eyes, becoming unfamiliar and unreachable, and even the entire world was on the verge of collapse and was about to fall into an irreversible fate of destruction. But strangely, this time he didn't feel much regret in his heart, because he did his best and left no regrets. Whether it was Erwin, Princess Griffine, Freya, Scarlet, Medicia, or the Roman, the merchant lady, his fiancée. He looked at the road in front of him. It was a gray road that was completely different from the land of Wonde. At the end of this road, He thought that perhaps it was the end of his dream. Whether it was to save the Roman or to be destroyed with this world, he didn't have much regret in his heart. He thought that perhaps this was the end of a distant memory. At the end of everything it was the eternal silence in the end. But this time there were many people with him. It wasn't just Miss Tada and the Termosian people. He saw many people's faces from the same gaze. Those people were Black Tea, Pulley, Shadow, and his former comrades in the Amber Sword. He felt as if everyone came to his side. And this time there was also a senior accompanying him. Just like the final battle in the Crimson Valley. He still remembered the cold rain at that time. Lute, Brando suddenly asked. Where is the fire scepter? Lute sat on his shoulder, turned his head to look at Brando's side face, shook his head and said, It is in the Mountain of Quenching Storm right here. Miss Tada said that there is no concept of space in the Mountain of Quenching Storm. Where we can go here depends on where we want to go. The yearning in our hearts is like a bridge, connecting each other's arrival. In other words, Brando said, the fire fairies only know that it is here, but no one knows where it is. Only when it wants to see us can we find it. To put it simply, it was to leave it for the fated person. Brendel knew that the Amber Sword liked to do this kind of thing and he hated it. But Lute shook his head seriously. He replied with certainty, No, you will definitely find the fire scepter. Why? Because Miss Tada and I both believe in this. You should also believe that you can do it, Mr. Brando. If you can't do it, then there is no hope in this world. Brando did not agree with this statement. Although he was not a doctrinaire materialist, sometimes he would prefer to believe in the former. Subjective initiative was important, but some objective facts would not change because of one's will. Of course I believe in it, but this may not solve the problem. Brando replied, We can't just walk aimlessly here, right? Although I have no doubt about your and Miss Tada's vision, it doesn't change the fact that we still don't know how to find the fire scepter, right? He thought he was being straightforward enough, but he did not expect Lute to be stubborn beyond his imagination. The Blessed of Forsyth shook his head firmly and said, Sometimes if you want to, then you will definitely find it. This is the Mountain of Quenching Storm. If you still retain the logic of the earth, then it will not work. He's right, Brando. At this time, White Mist also stopped the meaningless conversation with Fias. She turned to Brando and said, This is outside of the elemental plane. It is the world of spirit and will. You must understand this. Try to abandon some common sense and strengthen your belief. Then what should I do? Brando could not ignore White Mist's advice. As I said, believe that you can find it. Strengthen your belief, Mr. Brando. Lute replied, This is actually very simple. You just have to let go of the absurdity in your heart. And this experience will be very useful for you. The extreme plane is to abandon some common sense of wound and integrate into the essence of the world. In the world of laws, will and spirit are the most important. White Mist added. Brendel furrowed his brows. No matter how he said it, he really did not know where to start. It was like a person who was used to walking normally and could not get used to walking backwards, let alone running. Lute said to strengthen his belief and let go of the absurdity in his heart. Then what should he do? Should he just say in his heart, Scepter of Fire, quickly appear. I will definitely find you. And that would be enough? That would be a little too ridiculous. Brando's heart was filled with this somewhat irritating thought. But just as he was about to say it in his heart, he suddenly opened his mouth in shock. All of a sudden, he saw a towering mountain peak appear behind the fog. He could point to the heavens and swear in the name of Martha and all the gods and Buddhas that a second ago, there was definitely no such mountain in front of them. This Brando was a little shocked. This kind of thing completely overturned his common sense. They were clearly in the Greystone Wilderness, which was very close to the shallow gray bay. He still remembered that when he had just walked down from the nearby cliff headland, there was a low, uneven wilderness in front of him. That's right, the shallow gray bay. Brando hurriedly turned his head and found that the shallow gray bay was still behind him. Behind the mist, he could even see the long white trails left behind by the Termosian fleet disappearing on the surface of the sea. But when he turned his head again, his eyes could not help but widen even more. Because in front of him was no longer a towering mountain. To be precise, it was a mountain range. The shadows of the mountains overlapped with each other, stretching and undulating, forming a high gray wall. Even without being reminded, Brando knew that it was the mountain of stopping the storm, the sacred mountain of the wind elemental plane. And in front of him on the tallest mountain peak, lightning surrounded it. Between the clouds and the top of the mountain, there seemed to be something like an extremely magnificent building complex. What is this? Brando could not help but ask Prince Lute on his shoulder. How did this come about? You really did it, Flaming Blade's adorer. Lute was also very excited. His golden eyes seemed to be lit up. He clenched his fists and said excitedly, "That is the sacred mountain." Sacred mountain? What sacred mountain? Oh. Chapter 1153. The Prime Material Realm. At the same time as Rushta, only a few seconds had passed on the clock. Hippamera stood in the ruins near the 12th moon square for a moment before turning to leave. At that moment, the will of the mountains and rivers in her hand suddenly vibrated, followed by a second vibration. Hippamera was stunned for a moment. She lifted the cross warhammer with both hands and saw the sacred relic emitting a soft white light as it flew up from her hand and floated in the air. St. Cantifer Palace, Garden of the White Rose. Huh. Medisa suddenly stopped and looked around with a surprised expression. She frowned and showed a trace of unease. What's wrong? The Shire noticed her unusual behavior and asked. Nothing, his lordship is. Medisha looked at the empty stag and sprite slots in her deck and felt empty. Why is his lordship not back yet? Why didn't he say anything just now? The Garden of the White Rose was in a state of chaos. Old Prime Minister Nydivan and Archseigneur Vala had already activated the long-distance teleportation circle that originally belonged to the Kurlutz royal family. It was actually a small door of flame, but this action had instead aroused fear in the hearts of the people. The news spread like wildfire, and carriages came and went outside the palace gates. A few of them even drove directly into the White Rose Garden. No one cared about the majesty of the royal family at all. It was as if doomsday had arrived. There was a limit to the number of people that could be teleported each time. The nobles lined up according to their ranks. The first to be teleported were the nobles that Brando had rescued from the Flowerleaf Domain, East Metz, and other places. Then, there were the few remaining members of the royal family of Cruz, the House of Nydivan, and some of the clergy of the Holy Cathedral. Vahina wanted to stay and wait for Brando's return, but Medisha persuaded her to leave. Only Medisha, the Shire and Scarlet were left in Brando's entourage. But even they had to leave in the next few teleportations because Rushta had become extremely unsafe. People gazed uneasily at the golden threads that fell to the ground outside the arched windows. It was as if a golden rain had fallen under the night sky, but the earth was shaking and letting out a dying roar. Where's Miss Magadol? Is the envoy from the Antibureau Principality not here yet? Someone in the crowd shouted anxiously, repeating the question over and over again. An official dressed like a foreign affairs minister ran through the crowd, repeatedly confirming the identities of the envoys from the other countries. Although Rushta might not be able to escape, the empire would not fall because of this. If the envoys from the other countries who were gathered here were killed because of their negligence, the empire's prestige would fall apart. But time was running out, and there was still no sign of Antibureau and the envoys from the Duchy of Insignia. The latter was fine, but the former included the nun Princess Magadol, and she could not afford to lose her. A few clerics belonging to the Holy Cathedral had already rushed out of St. Cantifer Palace and got on the carriage, heading towards the street where the Antibureau Principality was staying. In the darkness, a tall silhouette stood by one of the arched windows of the palace, leaning against the long curtains that hung from the window lattice to the ground, quietly watching the scene. She was the only direct member of the House of Nydivan who did not leave. To be exact, she was the only one who did not participate in the teleportation. Delphian did not know why she did this. She was a calm person, or rather, she thought that she should be calm and rational. She should not act without thinking and do something impulsive. But she could not find a reason for her actions. She seemed to have thousands of thoughts in her mind. Sometimes she told herself that she just wanted to calm down for a while. After all, as the granddaughter of Prime Minister Nydivan, a member of the House of Nydivan, she could leave at any time. But sometimes she told herself that she just wanted to see if that person could come back. Even if she had to die with that person, it was enough for her to get what she wanted. But what frightened the Prime Minister's daughter was that she clearly heard a voice in her heart telling her, "It's not like this, it's not like this." The scene of Brendel standing proudly before the entire empire in the Garden of White Roses appeared in her mind more than once. Everything that she pursued and valued was completely destroyed. Even though she knew that Brendel was not targeting her, she still felt like she was stripped naked and standing in front of everyone. She was so pitiful that she felt like a clown. Delphian recalled all of this, but her heart throbbed. Why is it like this? Did I make a wrong judgment? She did not say a word, and her face was terrifyingly cold. A few young nobles who wanted to approach her stopped in their tracks. There were fewer and fewer people in the palace. Groups of people passed by her, and groups of people left one after another, until a royal steward came up to remind her that she had to leave. But Delphian did not seem to hear. The steward wanted to say something, but suddenly, a buzzing sound came from behind them. The crowd was in an uproar. The two of them instinctively turned their heads and saw the crowd in the Garden of the White Roses banquet hall disperse, revealing Countess Valach in the middle. Scarlet was looking at the azure spear in her hand in surprise. She saw the holy spear of heaven vibrate slightly, glowing all over. It broke free from her hand and gradually floated in the air. "Ovina, what's going on?" she asked in surprise. The spear spirit of the holy spear had already shown herself. She floated beside the Highlander girl and looked up at the azure spear in the air. Her emerald eyes were filled with shock. "The holy cathedral has reappeared, Scarlet." "What?" "The majestic mountain holy cathedral has reappeared. The king of the earth has been born." "Does this have anything to do with the Lord?" Scarlet thought for a moment and asked with concern. Ovina looked at her and could not help but sigh. This silly girl had completely fallen for it. To be honest, as a follower of the Azure Knight, she admired masters who were more independent. But there were certain qualities in Scarlet that truly moved her. After all, the two of them were different. If the Azure Knight was a pioneer, then Scarlet was at most a qualified successor. But not every era needed an Azure Knight. The innocent girl in front of her was clearly the most compatible master of the Azure Spear in this era. She shook her head and then nodded. "I don't know, but I think it might be related. Hurry up and hold on to the Holy Spear. If you can't get the Azure Spear's approval now, it will return to the place where it was born." "But what should I do?" "Hold on to this spear. You are the Azure Knight. But don't bind its will. The will of the earth will eventually submit to the king. Avoid the crowd. It will open a door to the mountain of ceasing storms. Don't hurt anyone else." Scarlet nodded and flew into the air. Everyone in the hall watched the newly conferred countess. When she grabbed the azure spear's handle, she felt a slight tremor in her hand. This is south of the Empire Anslova region. There were very few people in the highlands and lowlands. From the Lone Port to Vargas, there was almost no order. Since a month ago, when the allied forces of Jorgendi Ridge and the Toquinen Lion men were defeated in the north of the Evergreen Corridor, the defeated soldiers retreated and fled to some areas southeast of the Sublime Inland Sea in the south, causing the security here to deteriorate. The natives of Jorgendi Ridge, some troglodytes, lizardmen and bugbears, were entrenched in the countryside, doing what they did in the underground world, robbing. A few underground lords occupied towns and ruins, but just like their rule in the underground world, they did not care about the wilderness. Other than the area occupied by the Medusi, which still had some characteristics of civilization and order, most of Anslova had returned to the wilderness. These places took humans and elves hundreds of years to build in the Year of Glory, but the war took less than 2 months to completely destroy everything. A fleet was slowly sailing above the clouds. Like a shadow hanging above the clouds, the sails of the fleet were densely packed like fish scales, sparkling in the night sky. The residents of Anslova hid in the forest and ruins, watching this strange scene. Then most of them carefully shrank back. They knew that this was the humans' floating fleet. If it were a month ago, this fleet would probably have been attacked by hordes of dragons. But at this time all the glory was long gone. Not to mention that the White Legion, which had been incorporated by the eldest prince, could come south at any time through the Evergreen Corridor. Even the Red Legion in the wilderness of the Four Territories could attack from the east at any time. No one knew how long they could stay on this land. The fleet passed over the Anslova region and was immediately attacked by a falling meteor. A golden line passed through the fleet, causing 2 or 3 warships to catch fire. The meteor eventually hit Bear Lake, completely erasing the lake from the Empire's territory. It also vaporized thousands of troglodytes and bandits nearby. But the fleet was also affected. They had no choice but to descend from the clouds and land in the nearby hills. The 3-masted Everton airship landed in a small valley. A group of people immediately disembarked, passed through the nearby forest, and occupied a high point outside the valley. Knight escorted a young man and a snake-haired woman out of the forest and looked at the nearby hills. Warships were descending in the night sky, densely packed, like clouds hanging down from the sky. Haru's gaze was on the alluvial plains in the distance. Back then, he and his teacher had taken this path to avoid the pursuit of Jorgendi Ridge's army to Lone Harbor. At the end of their vision was Vargas. Thinking back, it felt like yesterday. On the pitch-black horizon there were a few sparks of light. Other than that, the entire land seemed to have fallen into a deep slumber. The young prince knew that those sparks were probably the lizardmen's tribes, and the Empire's lights had long since been extinguished. He could not help but feel a little sad. He still remembered that when he came here, the night here was still very bright. The plains were filled with the lights of the towns. Chapter 1154. How nice it would be if there was no war. Haruz could not help but whisper, his silver eyes quietly reflecting the golden light hanging from the sky. Although the young prince did not know what it was, he instinctively felt that it might have something to do with his teacher. Miss Lasmika, the black moon is broken. What is this sign of? Medusa seemed to be thinking about her own matters and did not respond for a while. She looked at the wilderness, and the dark earth seemed to symbolize the uninhabited land. Looking out from the hills, only deserted fields could be seen. A windmill stood alone on a distant hill, reflecting the blazing fire in the Bear Lake area. The leaf fan of the windmill had long rotted away, leaving only a bare frame, which had been torn down in half by someone. It was hard to believe that this was once one of the most agricultural and prosperous areas of the empire. It supported the food consumption of Cloak Bay and Anzaruta. Now the roads to and from various places had been cut off, and commercial and trade activities had long since come to a standstill. There was no telling what kind of famine would happen in the empire this year. Lasmika could not help but think of her hometown. In the eyes of the underground people, the beauty there was no less than here, but it was now gone. Miss Lasmika? What's the matter with you? Haruz looked at her with some confusion. He had never seen Medusa so distracted. Sorry, Lasmika suddenly realized. She pressed the scales on her forehead and said, I was distracted. What are you thinking about? Haruz asked. I'm thinking about the dark elves. Lasmika lied. But it was not a complete lie. Around the middle of autumn, a clan of dark elves came to the surface and established their own territory far away from Medusa's territory. They brought long-awaited news from the underground world to the underground residents of the surface world. The demons had crossed the ash tip and began to attack the area above the beehive. Although Valhalla's fleet sailed in the sky, when they were not performing the teleportation jump, they still sent people to the ground every day to collect information about the nearby areas. One was to confirm possible enemy information, and the other was to replenish food and water. Of course, in a barren place like Anslova, the former was more of a factor. The fleet had already inquired about the dark elves that Lysimika mentioned a few days ago. Others only treated it as a topic of conversation, but it was of great significance to Lysimika. Are you homesick, Lasmika? Haruz asked in a low voice. I don't have a home, Your Highness. Haruz looked at her curiously. Lysimika sighed and explained. I was once a slave of a demon. People who are treated as slaves have no home. We were expelled from our homes and lost what we originally belonged to. Haruz was a little sad when he heard this and hurriedly said, Miss Lasmika, maybe you can ask teacher to help you. He once defeated those demons, so he must have a way. Haruz appeared to have full confidence in Brando. In his opinion, Brando was probably omnipotent, at least he had never let his student down. Lasmika glanced at the little prince and shook her head. She did have such an idea, but until today, the fall of the black moon meant the coming of dusk, and she understood that the demon's strange movements might have come from this. If it was the end of the world, the young man in the bugas could not change all this. Thinking of this, she could not help but press the pendant of the necklace on her chest. But it was at this moment that the necklace vibrated slightly. Lasmika was horrified. She raised her head, her prismatic eyes staring at the dark woods not far away, and shouted in a low voice, "Who's there?" There was a low exclamation of surprise in the forest. "Lasmika, is that you?" Haruz did not know what was going on, and he could not help but look around. The knight in the woods behind noticed the movement here and drew his sword. Then he saw Miss Medusa next to him frozen in place as if she had been petrified. "Kaya?" Lasmika asked tentatively. There was a cheer from the forest. Then a young girl holding a longbow and wearing a long cloak jumped down from the tree. Her hood was folded behind her neck, revealing a head of beautiful white hair and pointy ears under the moonlight. She was obviously an elf, but her body was much shorter than the average wind elf and silver elf. Her skin was dark, and the sides of her straight nose were slightly sunken. In her eye sockets were a pair of eyes that sparkled like rubies, making people subconsciously think of certain legendary vampires. But there was no doubt that the other party was not an undead, but a distant relative of the elves in the underground world, a dark elf. Haruz did not expect Lasmika to appear as soon as she mentioned these dark elves to him. And it seemed that this dark elf girl knew Miss Medusa beside him. The moment the dark elf girl Kaya saw Lasmika, she could not help but let out a cry of excitement. She threw away her longbow and rushed over, hugging Lasmika tightly. Miss Medusa hurriedly stopped the knight who was approaching from behind, and then hugged the little girl. She was also a little excited. She first held the other's face and looked at it carefully, then kissed the other's forehead according to the Medusa's etiquette. Haruz had been with her for a long time, and he knew that this etiquette was used by the Medusas to the people closest to them. He could not help but look at the dark elf girl with some curiosity. In some of the knowledge that Brando had taught him about Jorgendi Ridge, the dark elves were independent, and this matriarchal society had nothing to do with the other residents of the underground. Lasmika and Kaya chattered in the underground language for a long time before Lasmika took the latter's hand to Haruz and introduced her to him. "Your Highness, this is Kaya. I met her in the demon slave camp. She has saved me several times." "Sister Lysimika has also saved me several times," Kaya said, her pronunciation perfect. This dark elf girl actually knew the language of the ground, and her intonation was also very standard. "Greetings, Your Highness, human prince. Joksha is protecting you." Haruz knew that Joksha was the spider goddess, but she was also Martha. She was similar to the goddess of the dead moon that the undead believed in, but was actually just a side of order. "Hello, Miss Kaya." He nodded politely and then looked at Lady Medusa. Clearly, he had not figured out what was going on. Kaya brought news about the underground. Lasmika understood what the little prince's eyes meant and quickly explained. "Didn't you ask earlier what the fall of the black moon meant?" "Your Royal Highness, it means the awakening of dusk." "Ah." Haruz was startled. "Don't worry, Your Royal Highness." Miss Medusa waved her hand, indicating that the other party should not interrupt her. "But the Twilight Dragon seems to have lost contact with this world, and the demons are in civil strife because of this. All this happened 2 months ago, and Kaya and the others escaped at that time." 2 months ago? Haruz remembered something. "Wasn't that when we first met the Dragon Queen?" It was almost that time. The demons were still fighting each other until a few days ago, which means that something must have happened to the Twilight Dragon, Lasmika said with some excitement. "The black moon fell, but the Twilight Dragon did not appear. Maybe the rumor is true." "What rumor?" "It is that the Azure Knight completely defeated it. If it does not appear after the end of the demonic wave, the demons will retreat to the Sea of Chaos. Maybe we will have a chance to return to the Tip of Ashes." Miss Medusa's voice could not help but raise a few notches. She clenched her fists and her eyes sparkled. Haruz had never seen her like this. "Miss Kaya," he turned back and asked, "is what Lasmika said true that the Twilight Dragon is dead?" Kaya shook her head blankly. "I don't know, but the demons have indeed begun to have civil strife. They stopped in front of the big hive and killed each other in Jorgendi Ridge. We took this opportunity to escape." She thought for a moment and said, "Your Highness, my people and I have nowhere to go at the moment. I heard that the Empire may recover this place at any time. I heard from Sister Lysimika about you and your sister. I would like to beg you to take us in temporarily. We will definitely be able to help you." Ah? Haruz was stunned. He knew that there must be more than one or two dark elves who escaped to the surface. Since they could be called a clan, there must be at least hundreds of them. Although the dark elves were a matriarchal society, they were brave and good at fighting. They not only had to compete with other races underground for territory, but also fought with the demons all year round. Their individual combat strength was in fact far superior to their relatives on the surface. These people were not only a force to be reckoned with, but they could also be trouble. His understanding of this race was limited to what Brando had told him, and he could not tell what their personalities were like. If these dark elves were aggressive, greedy, and ambitious, then wouldn't he be bringing back trouble for his sister? The little prince could not help but feel a little distressed for a moment, thinking that if only his teacher were here, he would be able to make a decision easily. "Your Royal Highness," Lysimika suddenly said, "promise her that the dark elves will not stay on the surface for long. When the demons retreat, we will return to Ash's Tip. But before that, we can help you and your sister a lot." Haruz frowned and rubbed his eyebrows. This action was very much like his sister's. If Brando were here, he might have mistakenly thought that he was looking at the little princess he saw in the dream. "Miss Kaya," he thought alone for a moment, imagining how Brando would deal with this problem if he were here, and then said, "Can you tell me more about the Twilight Dragon? What happened?" Haruz decided how to answer this question after confirming that the demons would retreat into the chaos. Kaya was stunned when she heard this question. She probably did not understand the connection between the two, but she reacted quickly and answered almost subconsciously. But this sentence was spoken too quickly and did not seem to be in the language of the surface, so Haruz did not understand it at all. Even though the little prince did not understand, Lysimika did. Her expression changed slightly and she said subconsciously, "Impossible." Unexpectedly, Kaya did not obey her this time. The dark elf girl shook her head firmly and said something again. Because she was talking to Lysimika, she opened her mouth and said a series of words in the underground language. When Lysimika heard this, a look of shock appeared on her face. She subconsciously put her hand on her chest and felt the necklace around her neck vibrate slightly again. Then it suddenly began to glow and slowly rose from between the Medusa's snow-white cleavage. Kaya stared at the pendant with burning eyes, as if she had seen something sacred. Chapter 1155. Have you ever seen a lonely mountain? The mountain was as green as jade, and white clouds surrounded the lonely peak all year round. It was like a sharp sword piercing straight into the clouds. Goshawks could only reach its mountainside, and the mountains could only be its background. Brando looked up at the lonely peak and was speechless for a long time. He thought that the mountains of the Loop of Trade Winds were majestic, and the mountains of Algash were steep, but they had to crawl and submit in front of this lonely peak like a king. There were some natural scenery that could hit the heart and shock people, and this lonely peak was undoubtedly one of them. A long ladder hung down from the top of the mountain, and there were countless steps. Each step was paved with gray marble, and on both sides of the long ladder, there were also countless marble pillars. The long ladder connected to the group of temples on the top of the mountain, and it became thinner and thinner as it went up, and finally became a straight black line. Blessed of the flaming blade. Now I'm starting to believe Miss Tilia's words. Lute flew up from Brendel's shoulder and muttered to himself as he looked at the majestic mountain. What? Brando looked at him in confusion. This is the throne of Himalud. Brando was stunned, and he looked at Lute in the air as if to confirm that the latter was not joking. Legend has it that Himalud placed her throne at the top of the mountain, and on this peak was the temple of Gaia, the goddess of the earth, and the hometown of Himalud's shepherdesses. Legend has it that it was located in the mountains to the north of the White Plains, but since the disappearance of the three sacred objects of the Temple of the Earth, this sacred mountain in the hearts of the Toquenin lion men and dwarves had disappeared for thousands of years. The fairy's face was very serious, and Brando realized that the other party was not joking. He then understood what Lute meant by the sacred mountain. That was the sacred mountain in the hearts of the Toquenin lion men and dwarves. But shouldn't it be in Woned? No, Lute shook his head. This mountain has always been here. Although it once appeared on the earth, it was a long time ago. Ever since the mortals lost the 3 holy objects, Himalad moved them back outside the elemental barrier in a fit of rage. It turned out that there was such a secret behind it. Brando finally understood. He stared at the palaces in the clouds and asked, "Is that the temple of the goddess Gaia? The flame scepter is here?" "I don't know either." "You don't know either?" Lute nodded seriously. "I only know that the flame scepter is in the mountain of quenching storms. Every chosen of Forsyth will come here on a pilgrimage. Only those recognized by the golden flame can decide the fate of the fire fairies. The fairy kings of each generation generally don't talk about their trial process, so most of the people of Forsyth don't know the specific location of the flame scepter. But," he continued, "it's very likely to be here, up here." Brando looked up the stairs. The marble pillars on both sides of the stairs were engraved with ancient runes. This was a pilgrimage path. For thousands of years, the believers gently touched these pillars with their hands and walked up the stone stairs step by step, chanting sacred prayers until they reached the top of the mountain. His eyes looked far into the distance, as if he had crossed the river of time and saw scenes that belonged to that era. The shepherdesses wore holy robes and held shepherding staffs. They covered the stone steps with a thin layer of soil to symbolize that the people of the earth lived and prospered on the ground, passing down the teachings of the goddess from generation to generation. It was not until a long time later that Brando retracted his gaze. He took a step forward, but Lute stopped him and said, "Wait, do you know who the last person who summoned the sacred mountain was?" Brando stopped, looked at Lute and replied, "Wasn't that your fire fairy? The last fire fairy king?" Lute shook his head like a rattledrum. "That's not the same, I'm talking about mortals." "No. Perhaps they can't be considered as mortals." He looked at Brendel with a conflicted expression. "It should be someone like you. Someone like me, a planeswalker? Maybe you can say that, but not exactly. It's more or less like you. Do you know who it is?" Then, without waiting for Brando to answer, he continued, "The blessed of the flaming blade. The sacred mountain means something completely different to people like you. It's a trial." By this time, Brando had already guessed who Lute was talking about. "The lofty mountain trial, the night of the azure sky?" Lute nodded, looked at him silently and murmured, "Miss Tilia's prophecy may be true. The lofty mountain trial is just the beginning, but it's the highest standard." "You mean that trial isn't the only one?" "Of course it's not the only one. It's a trial for those who recognize the 7 sacred objects. The previous dark dragons could only get the king's trial. The previous dark dragons. They're candidates." Malurcha carried Fayaz and White Mist and followed. White Mist answered, "But they might not be recognized. In earlier eras they weren't the only ones. But regarding the content of the trial, Odin never mentioned it. No one, including the Witch Empress, knows." The little fairy seemed to be hesitating. He seemed to want to express something, but he couldn't say it. In the end he said, "The blessed of the flaming blade, once you take this step, there's no turning back." "There's danger?" "Danger you can't imagine. The Night of Azure Sky took 40 years to pass the lofty mountain trial and get the recognition of the mountains. He was on the verge of death several times. If it wasn't for his iron will, he wouldn't have been able to hold on. If he died in the trial, he would really die. You're still too weak. The key is that no one can help you. Not even your planeswalker ability. Right, I might be able to travel with you. I'm also summoned by the Scepter of Flame." Brando looked up and glanced at the stairs that led to the sky. Then he turned around and said to the others behind him, "Wait for me here." As he spoke, he took a step forward without hesitation and stepped onto the first stone staircase of Himalad's throne. "Wait for me," Lute shouted and rushed up. But just as he flew up the stairs, he found that he had lost sight of Brando. Brando found that the moment he landed, the stairs disappeared. The marble pillars on both sides of the stairs also disappeared. The sacred mountain disappeared, and the palaces on the mountain peak naturally disappeared as well. A gust of biting cold wind blew in his face, and only then did he realize that he was in the middle of a snow-covered mountain range. The wind whistled between the mountains, and the mountain peaks were like exposed rocks that were as sharp as blades. The sky was gloomy, as if it was cast in lead. When the second gust of cold wind whistled, Brando felt a bone-piercing chill. This chill seemed to be able to penetrate his tough skin and reach his bones and internal organs. It froze his blood that was flowing like molten steel after reaching the extreme state. His powerful strength seemed to have disappeared, and he shivered in the cold like an ordinary person. Although Brando knew that this was just an illusion, he only needed to open the system to know that his strength had not decreased, but had increased. The Termosian robe he was wearing had been replaced by a double-layered chainmail. Between the seams of the chainmail, there was a thick layer of mink fur on top of the chainmail. The inside of the chainmail was padded with thick velvet, and there was also a layer of silk on the inside. The inner layer of the metal gloves was filled with the best deerskin and velvet, and there was also a thick layer of soft metal underneath the iron gauntlets. He also had a long bearskin shawl and a cloak. The craftsmanship was enough to put any craftsman of Ampere Seal to shame. Brando didn't even need to confirm the name of this set of armor. It was Corell's Courage, the hero's armor, and it was also equipped with a cold protection kit. Each piece was carefully selected by him from the market. Although it couldn't be compared to the magic kits that the rich used, it was at least the best of the best. He raised the sword in his hand. He didn't need to look at it. Just from the feel of the metal gloves, he could tell that it was an authentic Grecian sword. It was a two-handed greatsword. During combat, one would even need to hold the blade in one hand and the hilt in the other. The metal gloves were prepared for this purpose. This sword was called Engraved Spirit, one of the nemeses of the undead. This was the equipment he used in the last battle in the Alkash Mountains. Except for the items that he had prepared in his backpack, he didn't miss even the slightest detail. The blood in his body formed a perfect cycle, surging endlessly. Every inch of his muscles was like a sculpture. Every breath he took was long and powerful. The domain around his body had disappeared, and in its place was law and order that seemed to have merged with the whole world. Brando turned the sword upside down and used his finger to gently cut the blade. A drop of silver blood flowed out of the wound, and it healed in an instant. He exhaled softly. Perfect body, silver body. This was his peak state in the game. But where was this place? Brando looked around and finally remembered that he was in a trial. But why did the legendary Majestic Mountain test change his state to the last moment before he transmigrated to this world? He didn't know. Could it be that this trial was purely for the soul? Just as this thought appeared in his mind, another gust of cold wind hit him in the face. The biting cold of the north wind was like a knife hitting his face. It was so cold that he almost felt his skin cracking. He did not dare to touch his cheeks, for fear that there were already a few cuts there. In this extreme environment, before blood could flow out, it would freeze and scab. It was not impossible for him to accidentally tear off a piece of skin on his face. Chapter 1156. His silver body was like a piece of paper in this cold wind, and Brando finally understood why the Azure Knight had to go through so many life and death situations here. When he exhaled, the mist actually turned into ice shards that rustled down. Brando was shocked, and only then did he understand how terrifying the cold was. This was not a good place to stay for long, he immediately thought. He looked up and saw that he was on top of a glacier, and in front of him was a vast expanse of whiteness, as if it was a path. He looked back and saw that there was a bottomless abyss behind him. When he moved his feet slightly, countless ice shards rolled down until they disappeared. The abyss was pitch black and it was impossible to see how deep it was. Brando shivered. Although he still did not understand the purpose of this trial, the most important thing was obviously to leave this damned place. He was not unfamiliar with similar trials. There had been such trials from the Limiter to the Sage domain. Of course, the difficulty was not as high as this one. In theory, such trials were like a dream, but Lute said that if he died in this dream, he would really die. Brando definitely did not want to test it and challenge whether it was real or fake. However, such trials usually had a clear goal, which was to complete a certain quest or kill a certain monster. However, it was rare for one to be thrown into an inexplicably harsh environment like this. What was the purpose of this trial? Was it purely to survive? Brando felt that it was not that simple. He thought back to the trial of the Azure Knight. There were too many legends about this legend, and it was even written into many poems that circulated in Wonde. The contents of these poems were mostly similar, But the final result was that the Azure Knight was recognized by the mountains and obtained the Holy Lance of Heaven. So, was the purpose of this trial to find something? The Flame Scepter? Brando thought silently as he moved forward with difficulty in the glacier. Not long after, he felt that he was in trouble. The environment here was too harsh. The wind in the glacier was made up of some unknown law, and it was so cold that it made people shiver. His equipment were useless in the snow, and his silver body seemed to be useless. He had only walked less than a mile, and he felt like an ordinary person who was only wearing a thin layer of clothing trudging in a snowstorm. It might even be worse than that, because at least the snowstorm would not do anything to the soul. Brando quickly discovered that both his perception and willpower attributes were slowly decreasing. This discovery frightened him out of his wits. What the hell was this? He had never encountered a cold wind that could cause damage to his internal attributes before. Not to mention encountering it, he had never even imagined it before. Under the extremely low temperature, the metal quickly became brittle. Even the magic power attached to it could not protect it. The engraved spirit greatsword was the first to leave Brando. When he used it to support his body, the two-handed sword first broke into countless pieces with a crack. It almost made Brando fall into the snow. This almost made him break out in a cold sweat because he was not sure if he would have the strength to stand up again if he fell. But just as the cold sweat appeared, it immediately turned to frost, and his body temperature dropped even further. Brando could only throw away his sword and stagger forward. At this time he began to miss the flaming blade and the shallow sea sword. The former could provide him with warmth, and the latter could at least be immune to or at least greatly reduce the damage from the cold. However, he also understood that if this trial didn't restore his strength in the battle with Alkash, he would have turned into a popsicle as soon as he was thrown into this world. So Brando was not in the mood to complain. Of course, in fact, he did not have the strength to complain. He did not know how long he had been walking on the glacier. The world of white wind whistled as if there was no end, and his strength was quietly slipping away bit by bit, just like the temperature that had been gone for a long time. He had a perfect silver body. Although the silver blood of players was not comparable to a demigod, it was at least second to the level of a demigod like the angel Iroma. Legend had it that Tonkas, the son of God, once chased Leviathan at the end of the world for 100 years without rest. In the chaos where the laws collapsed, even the gods had to constantly consume the power of order to maintain the laws of their existence. But even so, no one had heard of Tonkas dying of exhaustion outside the elemental barrier. But Brando felt that he had only walked for a few days and nights in the snowfield, and his strength was on the verge of exhaustion. He began to feel that his vision was narrowing, and the edges of his vision were turning black. His breathing became heavier, and the cold air stung his nasal cavity. The sound of his lungs was like the struggle of a dying man, or a broken bellows performing its last duty. Not to mention that he had perfected his silver tier body in the game. Even in this world, he rarely felt this way after he had stepped into the gold tier realm. This was fatigue. For champions with hundreds and thousands of constitution, it was a joke that they would feel tired and tired. In a short period of time, his will and perceptive sense attributes were reduced by nearly 1/10. But the scenery in front of him remained the same. Brando did not know when this journey would end, nor did he know what this damn trial wanted him to do. Perhaps it wanted him to continue walking until he obtained the recognition of the mountains. But who knew what the hell the recognition of the mountains was? He walked for another 2 or 3 days, and the scenery in front of him still did not change. Later on, he was almost numb and his mind was blank. Originally, he could still feel the loss of his strength, but now, he could only move forward instinctively. Half a month later, Brando's speed began to slow down. Every few steps he had to stop and rest for a long time. He felt that his eyelids were as heavy as a few thousand pounds, but he instinctively did not dare to close them. He staggered and staggered forward, but he never sat down, let alone collapsed in the snow. This was because Brando knew that once he stopped, he might stay here forever. But his mind was not very clear, and he did not have the time to think about the trial. It was as if his mind was in chaos, and there was only one thought left to support his actions. Live. 1 month, 2 months, and in the blink of an eye half a year had passed. Even the strength of a sage had finally reached the point of exhaustion. On this day, Brando finally fell heavily into the snow, and the piercing cold and pain woke him up at once. But as he lay in the snow, he realized that he didn't have any strength to get up. He just lay on the ground quietly, staring at the lead gray sky, allowing the cold to seep into his limbs and bones. He began to lose feeling in his hands, his feet, the area below his knees, and then from his elbows all the way to his shoulders. He lost all feeling. Brando tried to mobilize the power of the law in his body, but the order seemed to have collapsed. His gaze passed through his extreme plane and saw a quiet universe. It was pitch black, without the slightest sign of life, as if there was only endless low temperature and cold. The stars were also extinguished, as if the dust left behind after a star burned out was still suspended in the void. The whole world no longer had a trace of life, and all the laws and order were shattered into pieces, no longer responding to anyone's call. This was the dusk of the gods and the world. Brando suddenly had such a realization in his heart. When a god died, it might see a world like this. He quietly rested his head in the soft snow, and began to feel a trace of warmth, as if his whole body was immersed in warm milk. He did not know if this was an illusion, but he only felt a wave of exhaustion sweeping over him. Brando knew what it meant as long as he closed his eyes, but he was powerless to stop it. There seemed to be a gentle voice in his heart telling him something. That voice told him that he was too tired, and that it was time to let go of everything. But it was at this time that he suddenly felt a trace of strangeness. It was the ground shaking. The snow was shaking slightly. Brando blinked slightly. He almost did not have the strength to make this simple action, but he quickly realized that this was not an illusion of a dying man. The ground was indeed shaking. Furthermore, the tremors quickly became more intense. It was as if a trickling stream had quickly converged into a surging and roaring river, causing the entire ground to shake and churn. Brando took a deep breath, and finally at this moment, he felt his body again. As if there was an inexplicable force bursting out from his body. It came from nowhere and instantly poured into his limbs and bones, like a warm current, instantly pulling him back from the edge of darkness. But Brando's heart was not happy at all. He knew what it was. It was his talent, unyielding. Although his strength and level had returned to before the battle with Alkash, his talent and profession had not changed. He was dead, but the talent of unyielding had brought him back to life temporarily. Now it was the dark magic that drove his body, just like a ghost. And he knew in his heart that if he could not find a solution before all this was over, then this was just a temporary reflection of the setting sun. But Brando did not dwell on this for too long. He hurriedly climbed out of the snow with this force. The shaking ground caused him a lot of trouble, but he finally gritted his teeth and stood up. Although he soon fell to the ground again in the violent tremors, he could finally see what had happened. He saw that on the white horizon, there seemed to be a gust of wind. This was not surprising, because there was always a biting north wind blowing in this place. It was just that it rarely formed a wall like this. Yes, a wall. On the horizon, Brendel saw a white wall that was being pushed forward by the blizzard. After a moment he recognized what it was. The glacier was moving. It was an avalanche. Oh! Chapter 1157. Brando's first reaction was to run to both sides of the valley, but his body had already reached its limit. Every step he took, he felt as if his whole body was falling apart. His speed was less than 1/10 of his usual speed. His indomitable talent only allowed him to prolong his life, but he was far from being able to escape the avalanche that was dozens of miles wide. The earth roared and trembled under his feet, making it impossible for him to stand still. Soon, the roar of the avalanche was behind him. Brando glanced back and saw that the ice wall in the distance, which looked like a line of snow, had turned into a glacier waterfall nearly 100 meters high. The waterfall swallowed everything in its path, mixed with countless sharp rocks. If a person was sucked into the waterfall, their fate would not be much better than being sucked into a meat grinder. But when Brando looked back again, he saw that he was at least a few miles away from the nearest high ground on both sides of the valley. His heart suddenly sank. Am I going to die here? He did not expect that he would not die in the hands of Madara's skeletons, not in the hands of Erwin's rebels, and not in the hands of the Silver Queen, but in a trial. This was the road that the man had walked, the trial of the mountains. The Azure Knight issued a challenge to the mountains. The biting cold wind tore at his face, but he was resolute and unyielding. It was as if nothing could stop him. In the end, he conquered everything and gained the recognition of the mountains. That was a story in myths, a hero in legends. Brando could not help but shake his head helplessly. He was still too far away from the legendary level. It was not that he did not want to, but he could not. The difference in strength was too great. He took a few deep breaths. He could almost feel the chill of the ice chips on his back. Although it was strange, he should not be able to feel the concept of temperature in his undead state. This thought flashed through his mind. Then he grabbed his cloak and tore it off with force. Then he threw it away casually. Throwing away the cloak, Brando used all his strength to speed up a few steps and suddenly jumped forward. In front of him was a black rock protruding out of the snow. He rolled and crawled in the snow and firmly grasped the rock. Brando did not intend to give up until the very last moment. Although the chances were slim. The next moment he felt a heavy blow on his back. Even though he had a silver body, the immense pressure still made it difficult for him to even breathe. With a muffled groan, his vision turned dark, and he almost fainted. Fortunately, his unyielding talent was strong enough to allow him to maintain a trace of clarity in such a situation. Brando could only close his eyes tightly, as if he was in the middle of a stormy sea. His hands tightly gripped the rock, refusing to let the moving glacier take him away. This was because he knew that once he let go, there would be no chance of survival. After several enhancements, the duration of unyielding innate skill was still several times longer than its initial state. However, it was still not too long. If he was buried under a layer of ice that was hundreds of meters deep, he would definitely not be able to save himself before the duration ended. He gritted his teeth and allowed the violent energy to pass by him, but he didn't waver in the slightest. Because he was so focused, he did not even notice that his fingers were inserted into the rock. The loose front part of the icefall was quickly washed away, and the dense back part made up of rocks and broken glaciers followed. After Brando passed the initial period of relaxation, he immediately encountered new trouble. The rocks mixed in the broken ice layer did not care whether he was the king of the earth or not, and he was not. A few rocks the size of a table suddenly hit his back. Normally, such an attack would be like a tickle to a silver body, but here Brando heard a series of crisp sounds coming from his back, and then a sharp pain swept over him. He immediately understood that it was the sound of his ribs breaking, but before he could let out a scream, a huge force pressed him down on the rock like an ant. Brando did not have any room to resist, and the air was quickly squeezed out of his lungs. If it was not for the fact that he did not need to breathe under the unyielding talent, this would have been enough to take away half of his life. But it was this blow that gave him the hope of survival. Brando quickly realized that the most difficult moment was over. Physical damage was not enough to make the unyielding talent ineffective. No matter how much damage he suffered, he could use the Angel's Heart Bottle to recover after this wave of glaciers passed. As mentioned before, although this trial had changed his equipment and status, his backpack and items had not changed. The Thunder God's belt, the Horn of Commendation, and even the floating sphere that Miss Tada had given him were all considered equipment. However, the Angel's Heart Bottle was a genuine item that could be used. It was currently lying safely in his backpack. In fact, if it was not for the fact that the Angel's Heart Bottle could not restore his stamina, he would not have to go through so much trouble. Although he did not feel that the speed of the glacier had decreased, the duration of the unyielding talent was still very long. The speed of the avalanche was too fast, and it would pass by here soon. But what Brando did not expect was that just when he thought that he had escaped disaster, the rock he was leaning against suddenly shook slightly, and then tilted in the direction of the glacier. Brando's heart thumped, and he suddenly fell to the bottom of the valley. He had thought of everything, but he did not expect that the rock he was relying on would be the first to give way. If it was taken away by the glacier, everything would be over. Of course, he could not allow such a thing to happen. He immediately tried his best to mobilize his power of law. He knew that at this time only the law of space could save him, but what made him despair was that just like before, the elements of space and time seemed to be frozen by the cold of this world, and there was no response to his call at all. After half a year of trekking in this extreme world, He had already exhausted his last trace of stamina and element power. But Brando still had a way. Give up the profession level. Give up the elementalist profession level. He ordered decisively. On his system panel, the elementalist profession level quickly disappeared, and almost instantly it disappeared from his profession list. Giving up the profession level to gain experience, and then using the experience to convert order points because this conversion was irreversible. Almost no one in the game would do this. But Brando did not have a choice. Even if he knew that the profession level he converted would still be counted on him, and the penalty for his part-time job could never be cancelled or reduced in any way. But at this moment he had no choice but to do this. The elementalist profession level was burned, but the order points obtained were still not enough for him to mobilize the law of space. Brando made up his mind and cut 5 levels from the Templar Knight. The Templar Knight profession that had been raised to level 50 with great difficulty suddenly fell back to level 45. But this time he finally obtained enough power. The silver lines of law once again lit up around his body. It was a pity that he could not obtain the order points from this world, otherwise, he would not need to use his element power at all since he had already perfected his body. Brando cursed this damned trial in his heart, and at the same time, he mobilized his law of space to stabilize the rock. His law of space recovered very quickly with the help of order points, and soon it extended to the root of the rock. At this moment Brando thought that he could almost see hope. But unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. At the last moment when he covered the rock with the law of space, the glacier wrapped in a huge rock hit him from behind. Brando did not have time to react, and his vision turned black. The lines of law that had been stabilized with great difficulty suddenly collapsed. No! He screamed and felt the whole world spinning. The rock in his hand had already loosened, and then it rolled forward with him. Brando's last thought was that he saw the rock that was the size of a mountain behind him crushing him. In the hills of Anzaruta, Haruz was staring dumbfounded at the necklace floating from Medusa's chest. It was a beautiful necklace, made of metal that looked like stars. It shone like a meteor flashing in the night sky. If he remembered correctly, that material should be the mithril that Master Tamar and his teacher had taught him, a rare and expensive metal. But what was really eye-catching about this necklace was not its chain made of mithril, but the pendant. The pendant that emitted a black light was leading the whole necklace to float in the air. Miss Lasmika, what is this? Haruz could not help but ask. What were you talking about? But no one answered his question. Lasmika and Kaya both stared at the pendant in the air with serious expressions. The latter was still looking at the former, and the former had a struggling look on her face. She finally reached out and tried to grab the pendant. But unexpectedly, Kaya grabbed Lasmika's hand. The dark elf girl shook her head firmly at her. The kingdom will fall, the earth will bear the suffering, the living will suffer in this fire, and there will be no light for eternity, she said to Lasmika in the underground language. No, Lasmika shook her head. This is our treasure. That prophecy can't be true. We can't believe in these illusory things. Kaya, you understand its value. Only by giving it to someone who really understands its value can we get what we want. Don't you want to go back? But Kaya was indifferent. She stared into Lasmika's eyes and said, I am Jokasha's priestess, and I know that the prophecy must be true. Look, Lasmika. The glory of the ancient kings has penetrated the clouds and shone on the earth. A voice is calling the king, but the world turns a blind eye to it. Oh! Chapter 1158. Look, Lasmika. The glory of the ancient kings has penetrated the clouds and shone on the earth. A voice is calling the king, but the world turns a blind eye to it. But so what? Lasmika broke free from Kaya's hand and grasped the pendant in the air. We don't even know who that person is. He has everything, but we will lose everything. Greed can blind people, sister. Dusk has come because of the day of final judgment. Dusk is dead, and the demons have fallen into civil strife. Sooner or later they will return to the chaos, and we must find a strong backer. Only he can let us take back our kingdom. Lasmika's eyes sparkled. The kingdom above the earth is more powerful than you and I imagined. Even the Dragon Queen is no match for the people on the ground. I have found someone who will let us regain the lost glory. Strangely enough, when she held the pendant of the necklace in her hand, The pendant seemed to have completely lost its magic and reappeared as an ordinary necklace pendant, lying quietly in her palm. The dark elf girl glanced at her, shook her head, sighed, and said nothing more. Miss Lysimeka? Lysimeka looked back with a sense of loss. She saw Haruz looking at her cautiously, and her prismatic pupils flashed slightly. She reached out and gently stroked the little prince's head. It's nothing, Haruz. This is a matter of our clan. She picked up the pendant in her hand, and the scales on the back of her hand shone in the moonlight. This is the treasure of my clan. Kaya is the priestess of Wuxia and the keeper of this treasure. This treasure is very important to my clan, so I will not let anyone else have it. Haruz looked at Kaya, who was not far away, dubiously. The dark elf girl chose to remain silent. Then Miss Lysimeka, please put it away quickly. I promise that no one can take it away from you. You are my sisters and my guest. We will protect your safety in Erewhon, he replied. Good boy, Lysimeka smiled. No one can take it away from you. But you still have to keep it a secret, because it will only bring you and your sister trouble. Do you understand? Haruz nodded. It was at this time that a melodious song suddenly came from the distant hills. Haruz turned his head curiously in that direction. He had never heard the language in the song. It was neither the song of the mountain people nor the local slang of Anzaruta. What's that? The young prince asked curiously. Golden rain was falling from the sky, and the flames seemed to light up half of the night on the distant horizon. He did not expect someone to be singing at this time. Moreover, this song seemed to have some kind of strange magical power that made people feel a little sad. That's the Lion Man of Toquinen. Lysimeka listened for a moment before looking in that direction and replying. Why are they singing? Haruz asked again. What are they singing? But this time Medusa didn't say anything. Instead, it was Kaya who glanced at the young prince and replied. Because thousands of years later, someone else passed the trial of the Chong Mountains, and a king was crowned with the crown that belonged to him. The lionfolk of Toquinen, the dwarves of the mountains, and the people of Jorgandi Ridge are all the people of the land. As she said this, her eyes fell on Lysimeka, but the latter did not respond. Instead she said to her, So what? How were we driven out of our homes and reduced to slaves of the demons? The people of the earth are long dead. Believe in yourself, Kaya, believe in the guidance of goddess Wuxia. The king of the earth is not the only one who has descended. Sister, you know that. Lysimeka's expression changed slightly. In the garden of white roses of the St. Kantapu Palace, all the guests in the banquet hall seemed to have forgotten the passage of time at this moment. People looked up like ducks with their necks pinched, their mouths wide open as they stared blankly at Scarlet in the air. The mountain girl held the trembling azure spear in her hand. The dreamy green spear pointed in a certain direction, as if it would fly out of her hand at any moment. Everyone saw that the golden and silver lines of law intertwined with each other, constantly appearing and disappearing in the hall. They gradually formed a mysterious picture around Scarlet. At this moment the whole hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Only Ovina's voice echoed under the dome. Hold me tight, but don't bind the will of the sacred relic. It seems to be saying something to me, Ovina. Scarlet shouted anxiously. Should I respond to it? That's not my voice but the echo of the mountains. Someone has passed the trial of the Chong Mountains. What does that mean? It means that a king has returned to Wonde and put on his laurel crown, so the sacred sword that belongs to him is about to return. Suddenly, a deafening roar that drowned out the conversation between the two reverberated in the hall. Scarlet felt as if the azure lance in her hand had become 1,000 times more powerful than before, and a vast will had descended upon the lance. A sacred symbol manifested in the hall. Lady Martha! Heavens, that's Lady Martha's sacred emblem. The hall was suddenly thrown into chaos. Ever since the gods left, no one had seen such a scene. Martha's sacred emblem manifested, as if that glorious era had returned to this land. But this scene only lasted for a moment. Everyone saw the spear in Scarlet's hand shoot out a blinding light. It formed a beam of light that shot towards the empty area that Scarlet was pointing at, the empty side corridor of the banquet hall, and hit an arched window there. Then a miracle happened. After the beam of light hit the arched window, it immediately opened a door. The door was a scene that no one had ever seen before. A shallow blue sea and rolling mountains on the horizon. The moment the door opened, the beam of light disappeared. Even the curtains and broken glass near the door were all sucked in. But in the blink of an eye, the door of light began to shrink and finally disappeared. Only Scarlet, who was still holding the azure spear, was left in the hall. She stared blankly at the scene, but after a moment, she acutely felt that something was missing from the azure spear in her hand. She turned around and was about to ask Ovina something. But it was at this moment that the entire Lushta suddenly shook. Almost everyone in the hall lost their footing and fell to the ground. After a moment of silence, someone asked in a panic, "What was that just now? An earthquake? Was the kingdom hit again?" But before he finished speaking, the glass of the arched window on the side of the banquet hall suddenly shattered. A gust of wind swept in from outside the White Rose Garden, and in an instant, all the candles and magic lamps in the hall were extinguished. Before the crowd in the hall could react, they were blown up by the strong wind and hit the wall one after another, and fell down again. The dark hall was suddenly in chaos. Although the nobles still did not understand what had happened, it did not stop them from making the worst guess. The darkness was immediately in chaos. People screamed and rushed in panic to the basement, the room where the long-distance teleportation circle was located. The crowd gathered together and almost washed away everything in their reach. The cries of women and children, the cursing of men, and the shouting of each other mixed together and went straight to the sky. Only a few people in the crowd were able to maintain their composure. Seal, Medisa, and Scarlet were among them. The three of them were different from the other nobles who were panicking, and they reacted almost immediately after the incident. The Shire immediately cast a protective spell on himself, while Medisha and Scarlet went against the flow of people, trying to rush out of the hall to see what had happened. Since Medisa's original position was closer to the front, she was the first to separate from the crowd and come to the promenade. At this time, the wind from the outside didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. The wind passed through the corridor, and the broken curtains of the arched windows fluttered. At a glance, it looked like a group of flying ghosts. When Medisha came to the corridor, she saw a man covered in blood running towards her. As he ran, he shouted at her, "Miss Delphian! Miss Delphian is gone." The little elven princess was slightly stunned. She quickly held the man and asked, "What did you say?" "The portal just now, Miss Delphian is gone." The man, who was obviously dressed as a royal butler, said incoherently. His face was covered in blood. Medisha just understood what he meant. Before she could ask for more details, the light in the White Rose Garden dimmed slightly. She looked up and saw something crawling in through the broken arched window. It was a creature made entirely of crystal. It was as tall as 2 to 3 people and took up half of the corridor. It looked a little like a spider with 4 pairs of legs and a distinct head, chest, and abdomen. The head was sharp and thin and looked like a hook. However, the thick carapace on its body was similar to that of some crustaceans, which made it look a little out of place. However, it was obvious that the creature was up to no good. The moment it saw Medisha, it raised its 2 front legs and a conspicuous red light flashed in its eyes. Crystal cluster. The little elven princess stared at the creature with a long spear in her hand and squeezed out 2 words from between her teeth. Time seemed to be in a state of stagnation for a long time. Brando once thought that he was dead. He felt that he was in a dark world with no up or down and no left or right. It was as if there was no passage of time and no concept of space. The only thing he could feel was his own thoughts. He couldn't make a sound and couldn't move. He didn't even know how much time had passed. Maybe it was a day, or maybe it was a year, or maybe it was completely stagnant. Due to the lack of reference, he only felt that it was an extremely long period of time. This is the world after death? He couldn't help but think. But soon he realized that he was wrong. Oh. Chapter 1159. In Brando's vision, there were many fragments that emitted colorful lights in the darkness. They were like glass shards scattered in the dark, reflecting light. They were also like mirrors, reflecting different scenes. Some of these scenes were what he had experienced before, and some were unfamiliar to him. These scenes kept appearing and disappearing with the flashing fragments, until a stable door of light appeared in front of him. It was a rather large fragment, but it had the shape of a glowing door. Brendel stared at the door, and the glowing door seemed to lead to another world. It was a courtyard that was intoxicated by a slight breeze. Carved beams and pillars, flowers surrounded it, and light songs were sung. The ivory-white pillars were hidden in the shade of the trees. The scene was emitting a faint light, like a picture scroll of time passing, as if Chang Chunyong was still in a dream. Brando saw rows of armored guards with shining silver scales, holding long halberds and silver-pointed helmets. They swayed with each other, and pointed ears were exposed behind the bright silver helmet. Their silver hair flowed down the back of the armor like tassels. At this moment he suddenly heard a voice in his ear. Why do you always like to peek into the inner world of others? Is the king in the prophecy someone like you? It was a woman's voice. It was a little hoarse, low and steady, reminiscent of the moonlight whine of the elves. It was mellow and intoxicating. Brando was slightly stunned. He wanted to look around before he realized that he could not move. However, the long period of darkness had sharpened his other senses, and his memory and imagination had become richer. The voice echoed in his mind for a moment, and he recognized its impossible owner, a person who should have died long ago. Bye. He could not speak, but this question automatically popped up in his mind. This is your memory? Aren't you dead? Or am I hallucinating? It's your illusion. This is hell. You're dead, so we can meet again. Bai's voice was still in the mood to joke. Seems that you're not dead. I'm not dead. You're lucky that you can wake up so quickly. I shouldn't have reminded you because it has nothing to do with me anyway. What do you mean? Because if you had told me earlier that you were the one chosen by Martha, you wouldn't have caused me so much trouble back then. You're a complete idiot. Also, I didn't think that the winner would be as useless as you. You almost died in the trial and almost caused me to die with you. You saved me. Brando did not pursue the question of why the other party was still alive. He could roughly guess the answer now. The woman's soul elemental power was quite high, so she was able to separate her soul from her body and store it in his body. This method of existence was very similar to how Saint Tossel the Wind Empress left her soul in the Holy Ring. The only difference was that Saint Tossel did not ask for his permission. It wasn't me. I couldn't save you, but I did wake you up. Did you wake me up? Brando gradually regained his memories. He remembered the broken glaciers and the rocks wrapped in the ice that were falling on him like Mount Tai. He remembered what happened before he lost consciousness. Do you remember now? Seeing that Brando was silent, Bai asked. I remember now. But why am I here? That's why you're lucky that you're not dead. And this is a very strange place. I have a suggestion. We can work together. Brando was silent. He did not believe this woman. Although the Black Knight of Madara did not have any bad records in history, she was still an enemy. But Bai seemed to have guessed his thoughts and said, You don't believe me? That's okay. I have a way to make you believe me. What way? Don't worry. I'll tell you the content of our cooperation first. I can tell you that there's something here. I must get it. You help me. Also, I want to borrow your angel's heart face. In return, I'll tell you something. Why do you need my help? Brando asked. Bai did not answer. So you can't move freely, right? Where is your soul hidden? He already got the answer. That's why I hate your cleverness at this time. It's the same at that time. Brando smiled. I'm lodging in your spiritual world. I've been very careful so you didn't discover me. Knowing that she could no longer hide, Bai's voice was filled with hatred. You actually dare to tell me? Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you? Although Brando already had some guesses, he could not help but be surprised when he heard Bai's words. In everyone's mental world, everyone was their own master. The dream world was only a part of everyone's will. But within it, he could still take whatever he wanted, kill or steal. Not to mention, the mental world of a planeswalker was an independent world that was completely under the control of the planeswalker. If he had known that this Black Knight was hiding in it, he could have turned her into ashes with just a thought. Bai did not explain. In fact, she knew that she had to face such danger if she stood out, but she had no choice. I'm Medicia's sister, she said in a low voice. You said that before. Brando also replied in a low voice. But you're an undead, tree herders, and one of the 12 patriarchs. And Desha is one too. Didn't you not kill her? That's because of Mistress Whitefog's orders. I don't trust you at all. You should understand this. Brando replied. He was not threatening her. In fact, due to the bad impression he had in the game, he did not want to make any deals with these evil cultists. Although this Black Knight did not have many records of going back on her words, she was cold and heartless. She was also not a trustworthy person. Bai hesitated. She began to worry if she had made the right choice. She knew that her fate was in the hands of Brendel, and he could destroy her with just a thought. She was really afraid that Brando was someone who hated the evil cultists. I joined the tree herders for a reason. Brando was slightly startled. What is it? I can't say more. This is all I can tell you. I'm not the same as the people you think I am. I don't care about the lives of others, but I believe that you're not that righteous, Bai said word by word. This is all I want to say. Other than that, there's nothing else. If you want to kill me, please. Is this how you want me to obtain your trust? Brendel did not answer her question, but instead asked a question in return. Not entirely, but it's not impossible. My life is in your hands, so what do you have to worry about? Her calmness made Brendel look at her in a new light. Her calmness made Brendel see her in a new light. No wonder she could become one of the famous 4 knights of the apocalypse. Then what did you want to use to gain my trust? He asked again. Don't you want to know where this place is? I can tell you that I can help you leave this place. You don't understand what this place means to you. You'll gain unimaginable benefits, and I just want to get back what I want. It won't help you at all. That's not necessarily true. Maybe what you want is a divine artifact. Intelligence merchants can't earn that much. After all, the ones who bleed are the adventurers and mercenaries, right? Besides, I can't guarantee that what you say is true. I don't care to deliberately deceive anyone. You don't have the right to do so, and there's nothing for you to hesitate about. You have the right to go back on your word at any time. Bai replied calmly. What? This time Brando was really surprised. I don't quite understand what you mean, Miss Tiamas. I've already said it very clearly. The initiative is in your hands. You can choose to believe me or not. You can go back on your word at any time because I need you to help me get that thing. My cooperation with you is based on your reputation. I'm just betting that you won't deceive a weak woman like me and that you will fulfill this agreement. She paused for a moment. So, can I let you get your trust now, Mr. Brando? Brando kept his mouth shut. He had never experienced such generous conditions before. If he really did as she said, even if he got that thing, whether he would give it to her or even kill her after she fulfilled the agreement was actually up to him. Of course, Brando knew that he was not that unscrupulous, but Bai did not know that. Besides, if she really asked for a very important divine artifact or a divine artifact, he would never give it away just because of this agreement. Just like what he said before, intelligence dealers would always make a small profit because they would never be the ones risking their lives. He might give Bai some compensation, but it was her own business whether she wanted it or not. But even so, she still insisted on using this method. Not only did this require generosity, but it also showed that this woman was extremely conceited. She obviously did not doubt her own judgment and choice. But what made Brando could not help but shake his head and smile bitterly was that she was quite accurate. I can only get half of your trust. However, his tone did not reveal any of his thoughts. He only replied, if you're not lying, we can take one step at a time. You're really being overly cautious. Bai said disdainfully. This was indeed being overly cautious. Brando could not think of any reason why she would deceive him, but it was better to be safe than sorry. It was always better to be cautious at this time. He did not comment on Bai's disdain. Anyway, the initiative is up to me. For you, the situation can't be worse, right? He replied. Chapter 1160. Although the atmosphere was neither harmonious nor harmonious, and one of them even had the intention of giving each other a cold shoulder, the two of them had finally reached a preliminary agreement. After the agreement was made, Haku remained silent. Brando could only take the initiative to ask, Miss Tiamas, since we have reached an agreement, you can tell me the details of the cooperation. What is this place? How can I help you? What is it that you want? Haku's answer to this series of questions was very simple. There's no need for that. She paused for a moment before adding, solve your problem first. You have to solve your own problem first before you have the right to talk about what's next. I spent a lot of effort to wake you up. But in fact, I still don't quite understand what kind of state I'm in now, Miss Tiamas. Although Brando had communicated with Haku for a long time, in fact, his situation did not change much. The world around him was still dark, and he still could not feel the passage of time and the existence of space. In fact, he still could not feel the existence of his own body. Before Haku appeared, he could not even confirm whether he was dead or alive. According to the clues in his memory, he should be considered dead. At that time, the duration of the unyielding talent was more than half. He did not know how long he had been unconscious for, but even if it was not long, he should have been buried under the glacier. Although the unyielding talent was almost invincible during the duration, if he did not replenish his lost life before the duration ended, he would still die. Haku said that she did not save him, so Brando could not think of any reason why he would be saved, unless this place was the same as the game where he could be resurrected after death. But thinking about it, that would be too ridiculous. I'm not too sure about the state of your body, but the only thing I can be sure of is that you're not dead yet. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here chatting with you. As for your spirit, it should have been heavily injured and fell into a deep slumber. You should be in your own spiritual world right now. As for why it's like this, I'm not too sure. Fortunately, my soul imprint is also in your spiritual world. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for me to wake you up. Haku replied. To be honest, I've never seen such a useless participant like you. I could have used another method to cooperate with you, but I didn't expect you to be so useless. You almost caused me to die with you. Her words were obviously not polite, but Brendel understood that Bai did not need to be polite with him. He only smiled and asked nonchalantly, "Then what should I do next, Miss Tiamas?" Although Haku was dissatisfied with Zhang Heng, he put away his complaints and replied, "Try to wake up your body and see what's going on outside. You have to find a way to get back to the glacier. I'll find a way to help you. If you're still in good condition. Then how should I wake up my body? Try. It's simple. Dream on." Dream? The witches believe that dreams are a process of self-protection for the world of will. Your body will naturally recover after confirming that your spiritual world is fine. This may be a long dream, but it may only take a quarter of an hour for you and me. However, this process is very important. Then what should I do? Do you see those fragments? Haku replied. Those are your dreams. It's just that I brought you from a deeper dream to this place. Now, you need to go back and experience a dream until you wake up naturally. Will this process be dangerous? Of course, there's nothing without danger in this world. There's also the danger of choking to death when eating. If your body stops breathing before you wake up, you'll naturally die. Haku replied snappily. Brando suddenly understood. He actually had a guess in his heart. That was, the duration of his unyielding talent might not have ended. He just fell into a state of self-isolation during the duration of his unyielding talent. If that was the case, he had to hurry up because no one knew how long the dream would be, and how short the duration of his unyielding talent would be. Thinking of this, he glanced at the colorful flashing fragments in the dark world, and subconsciously sank his mind into one of the fragments. The process of entering the dream was very fast. It was like the process of a person recalling something. It was as if he was already in the dream in an instant. However, the moment Brando sank into the dream, he vaguely heard an angry scream. Damn it, that's my memory, get back here. Then he did not know anything. It was like a long dream. Brando felt that he had a strange dream. In the dream, he remembered a completely unfamiliar memory. In that memory, he seemed to be a quiet bystander. He saw a glorious empire. An empire that belonged to the elves. He saw a great war, a war between the mortals and the golden race. He saw the end of the war. Blood flowed on the earth. The mortals formed an alliance on the ruins and built a new empire. He saw the long-eared elves make an oath and hide in the forest, never to come out again. Then there was a grand funeral. The misty rain shrouded the forest. The elves crowded around a hearse full of flowers. In the blooming flowers there was a small, cold body. According to the age of humans, she was at most 14 or 15 years old. Her flawless skin and face were like white porcelain, but there was no color. She was so pale that it was frightening. Her long eyelashes drooped, and she was wearing a gorgeous silver princess dress. She was lying quietly in a bouquet of lilies. It was Medusa, but she wasn't breathing. She didn't have that faint smile on her face, and she didn't have those eyes filled with wisdom. She was like a doll that had lost its vitality. She was just quietly sleeping. Brando looked at this scene silently, until he saw Bai in the crowd. Only then did he remember that she was Medusa's sister, the princess of the empire. In his sight, Bai Iran turned around and left the crowd. She changed into a knight's costume, passed through everyone, entered the forest and never came back. It was a long journey. She went to many places and saw the history of the people of Black Iron rebuilding their cities and civilization after the war ended on the land. Brendel and Haku traveled together. They passed through the wilderness, through the plains, through the mountains and hills, and through the dense forest. They passed through the desert, sailed across the sea on a sailboat, braved the scorching sun in the desert, reflected the stars in the sky, and sprinkled the clear moonlight on the plateau. It was a long journey. Time passed slowly. Finally, there were changes on the land. Settlements reappeared in the desolate wilderness. Merchants and caravans reappeared on the roads. There were more adventurers in the dense forest. Traveling was no longer lonely. Then crews built. St. Tassel was built. Fanzan was built. Alanta was built. The sages grew old and left the world. He saw the War of Mortals, the expansion of the Holy Cathedral on the land, the knight holding the glorious flag high to expand the borders of civilization, and the expansion and decline of the Black Forest. But Bai's journey did not end. He saw the woman silently searching. She joined the Holy Cathedral of Fire and became a pioneering knight of the Wind Elves. He saw her building a merchant group, becoming the Lord of the White City, leading a mercenary group to fight on the land of the 10 cities. He saw her depressed and desperate. She joined all for one and defected. She went through one fierce battle after another and finally died in a deserted forest. The birds sang in the forest, as if weaving a long and eternal dream. He saw her wake up and become an undead, wandering the land. But one day her journey ended. She met the Dragon Queen and became one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. Then everything returned to nothingness. The dream seemed to shatter, and the memory turned into countless fragments. Brando heard an angry voice in the darkness questioning him. He struggled to open his eyes and finally saw a familiar scene. It was a glacier. The glacier that spanned several miles appeared to be fragmented. He was lying in a long and narrow crevice formed after the glacier split open. He did not know how deep this crevice was, nor did he know how far it went. Its edges disappeared in all directions as if it would never end. Brando only took a glance to determine that this was directly below the glacier, but he did not know how deep it was. His mind was still in a mess, but the first thing he did was to check his status. The unyielding talent had entered cooldown. Looking at the character status, the buff provided by the unyielding talent had also disappeared. This meant that the unyielding talent had already ended. He was stunned for a moment and immediately opened the character panel. The panel showed that his current status could not be better. Not only was his HP full, but his elemental pool, mana pool, stamina, and the will and perception that had fallen were also fully recovered. The most unbelievable thing was that the profession level of the Templar Knight that he had given up was also back. The disappeared elementalist profession also appeared in the profession column. What's going on? On one hand, Brando felt a splitting headache. This was caused by the long dream. The chaotic memory fragments in his mind seemed to have a war with each other, causing each part of his brain to declare independence. He subconsciously wanted to immediately open his battle record, but at this time, a voice full of anger came from his mind. "You damned peeping Tom." Oh. Chapter 1161. Haku's voice seemed to have awakened Brando's memory all of a sudden, turning what he saw and heard in the dream into a trickle, quietly flowing into his thoughts. Brando suddenly woke up. Eternal indestructible, this was the first word that came to his mind. That was the most famous non-existent item in the Amber Sword, and the most typical example of it was the Angel's Tear, which was directly distributed by the system as the key to the player's resurrection. It could not be obtained through any means, it would not be consumed or lost. But it was non-existent to the natives, because even if the player took the initiative to mention this word in front of the natives, the system would directly block the player's speech. But how did Haku know about this thing? "You're looking for the eternal indestructible." He said to the voice in his head. You know about this thing? You want to resurrect Medisha? Shut up, you shameless. You know about the eternal indestructible. Haku's voice sounded a little shocked. Tell me first, where did you learn about this term? A dazzling person told me. Haku paused for a moment and replied. Dazzling people, they still exist? I once met one of them 1,000 years ago. It was a plane traveler. He only stayed in Wonde for a short time, and during the conversation with him, I learned about the existence of this thing. Brando remembered the scenes he saw in the dream, and the prejudice in his heart disappeared. You've been looking for it for 1,000 years? There are very few clues. You're the third person I've met who knows about the existence of this thing. Bai Lung calmed down and replied. The anger in her voice had gradually subsided. The anger came from the anger that came from the privacy of her heart being pried into by others. The first was that dazzling person, the second was a human, and the third was you. I'm human too. You're not human, maybe the blood of black iron flows in your body, but your soul may come from an ancient will. Otherwise there's no way to explain your authority and the knowledge you have, it's just that you don't know. Haku said with certainty. Brando was shocked. He did not expect that his secret would be guessed by this woman, although she was not sure in the end. What is an ancient will? He calmed down a little and asked deliberately. Who knows? That's your own business. If you don't know, don't expect others to answer. I'm just guessing. Bai's answer was within Brando's expectations. He listened quietly before changing the topic. Who's the second person you met? This simple question actually made Bai fall into a strange silence. He's from Erewhon. Erewhon's Min. Yes. It sounds like you don't want to talk about him. Brendel's sharp senses picked up on something. Even though he saw a lot of memories of Haku in the dream, it was still a dream. Even though it was strange and beautiful, it was not complete. That has nothing to do with you. The thing you want is the item of eternal indestructibility? Brando asked. No. I heard some things from Medisa, and I thought you didn't like her at all. Brendel could tell that Bai was trying to keep him at arm's length, but he still asked. You're right. Why should I like that little girl? Is it because she's the little princess admired by thousands and the most talented commander of the Allied army? Bai's voice was full of disdain. Brando could tell that she was not lying. He asked curiously, then why did you do all this? This has nothing to do with you. Because you were the commander of that battle, right? Bai did not say a word. Brando was not in the mood to continue this topic. He was not a person who liked to pry into other people's privacy, but he knew that Bai was not just trying to make up for her mistake. She must have wronged more than just Medisha in the past 1,000 years, but when did she care about other people's opinions? It was just that she did not want to admit it, and Brando did not want to force it. He thought of Medisha and could not help but sigh. If she knew what her sister had done for her in the past 1,000 years, she would be very happy. You can't tell Medisha. Wait, you're spying on my thoughts. Brando said angrily. Same to you. Brando immediately found Bai's existence in his spiritual world. He was a planeswalker, so it was easy for him to do this. Then he isolated her in a corner. Bai snorted, but did not say anything. Brando ignored the woman and opened his battle record. His eyes scanned down line by line, and soon, a special record jumped into his eyes. 0732, unyielding buff disappeared. 732, character died. 733, Cypher's heart, lofty mountain language, took effect. 733, 4755 HP gained. 733, 1422 MP gained. 733, 122 MP gained. Brando's gaze froze. Cypher's heart? He muttered to himself. What is this? But someone was more anxious than him. Lofty mountain language? What did you say? Say it again. Brando looked up, frowned and asked, did I say this word? Cypher's heart is the lofty mountain language. How do you know this thing? Bai's voice sounded a little anxious. What is that? Brando asked. Bai did not speak. Brando could not help but frown. Our cooperation is based on mutual trust. I don't want to threaten you, but if you hide everything from me, it will be difficult for me to believe your sincerity, Miss Tiamas. You can back out at any time. You don't have to threaten me. Bai replied. I want to back out now because I didn't get what I wanted from this cooperation. According to the agreement, you have to tell me where this place is and let me find a way to complete the trial, but you didn't do it. Brando did not back down. What does that have to do with this? Of course it has something to do with it. You don't understand my current state, right? I can tell you that I was resurrected because of this thing. Do you think it has nothing to do with the topic we are discussing? Brando replied. Bai's surprised voice seemed to have increased a lot. You were resurrected because of this? How is that possible? You know something, don't you? Brando asked sharply. Let me think. Do you have Cypher's royal bloodline? Brando was stunned, and then shook his head with certainty. The Highland Knights nobility had its own bloodline. They were not even distant relatives of the Erewhon royal family. If it was the Covardo royal family, they might have some relations, but as for the Cypher royal family, it was even more distant. The two families had never even had a marriage alliance. The Cruz royal family of the Cypher royal family was very strong. In the eyes of the Empire's people, they were the noblest branch of the Erewhon royal family. As for the others, they did not even care about the Covardo royal family, if not for the fact that the Covardo royal family had some elven bloodline. Let me see your necklace. Bai suddenly said. What necklace? I'm not wearing a necklace. Brando was stunned. His original necklace was destroyed in the battle with this woman. The remaining necklace was the heart of the sea that he exchanged with the Termosian, but he had not worn it yet. There was also Miss Tada's floating sphere, but that thing was not a necklace. It was actually a standalone item, and did not occupy the equipment slot of the necklace. Impossible unless you're lying. Wait. Brando also reacted. He suddenly reached his hand into his collar and pulled out a beautiful pendant. He held the necklace in his hand and suspended it in midair. The chain of the necklace emitted a star-like light, but the place where the pendant was supposed to be was empty. This is... Brendel frowned as he recalled the origin of this necklace. This was the necklace that Kiara had given him before she left. That mischievous little Princess Cypher. Wasn't she related to the Cypher family that Bai mentioned? Cypher's heart. He muttered. What does this have to do with the Cypher family? Other than the relic of eternal indestructibility, he had never heard of anything that could bring people back to life. If such a thing really existed, he and his senior sister would definitely look for it to bring the princess and the Valkyrie back to life. Unfortunately, there were no spells or miracles in Wone that could bring the dead back to life. Even holy items like the number 1 holy water and the angel's heart bottle could only bring people back from the brink of death. After all, it was an exaggeration to say that the dead could be brought back to life. If a person's soul had already passed away, then even someone as powerful as Martha could not bring them back to life. This was one of the basic laws of Wone. The only exception was the relic of eternal indestructibility. However, the relic of eternal indestructibility was only effective on players. It could not even appear in this world, nor could it be mentioned by others. It was like an item that did not exist that was compromised for the sake of the game. In fact, this was the title that the players gave it. However, this treasure that could bring people back to life, even if it was a one-time use item, was enough to overturn this understanding. Its value could not be overstated. It was very likely to be one of a kind. At least, Brando had never heard of an item with a similar effect. Even if it was an artifact or a holy item with a similar effect, it did not exist. The Supreme Queen of the Cruz Empire had died, and people could only let her die. Even Vala and Nydivan, who stood at the peak of mortal strength and power, could not bring out an item similar to the relic of Cypher's heart to bring the Silver Queen back to life. However, the Cypher family had such an item. From Bai's tone, it was obvious that they had more than one. Chapter 1162. As for the origin of House Cypher, everyone knew that it actually came from the Empire. The members of the family were Cruz people, and their bloodline was far superior to the natives of Erewhon. Its origin could be traced back to the ancient times of the Empire. As Miss Tada and Lute said, the ancestor of House Cypher, the ancestor of the late King Eric, might have been the chief knight who followed the Flame King Gretel. This period of history was considered glorious for the small kingdom of Erewhon, but it was also probably the most glorious and the only history worth mentioning for House Cypher. But it didn't count for much. After the War of the Holy Saints, There were countless families formed by the descendants of such heroes on the continent, just like the stars in the sky. Most of them had been buried in the annals of history, leaving no trace behind. Although House Cypher was lucky enough to survive in this period of history, compared to the ancient nobles who truly had a heritage, they actually had no confidence. It was like the nobles of a kingdom and the nobles of the empire could not be compared. In terms of heritage, how could House Cypher compare to the current royal family of Cruz and the royal family of Fanzan? These were the descendants of the two sages, but their descendants could not have a treasure, so how could House Cypher have anything to do with it? The more Brando thought about it, the more suspicious he became. Not to mention House Cypher, even Erwin would find it difficult to have the strength to keep such a treasure. What kind of secret could this family have? Their biggest secret was nothing more than the era of the War of the Holy Saints, and the history of that era was at most a drop in the ocean compared to the history of Wond. He held up the necklace in his hand and asked a certain soul in his spiritual world, "Miss Tiamas, do you know something? How did you get this necklace?" Haku asked. "A little girl gave it to me. She is the younger sister of the heir of House Cypher," Brando answered truthfully. "Little girl. She's a core member of House Cypher. She must know the value of this necklace. She's willing to give it to you." At least she revealed two things. First, she knows that the place you're going to next may be life-threatening. Second, she values you very much. Otherwise, this necklace is as important as her second life. Why would she give it to you so easily? Brando couldn't help but think of the mischievous little princess of the Cypher family. It was hard for him to imagine that such a little girl could have so many ideas. When she gave him this necklace, it was true that they had to go to the imperial capital separately. For an ordinary person, the place he was about to go to was a death trap. Kiara obviously knew what he was going to do, so she gave him this necklace. Brando's heart was heavy. No matter what he thought, he had to accept this favor. At this moment he thought of House Cypher. He thought of Kiara's brother, the blind eldest prince. He was obviously also a chosen one. He had the ability to rule a country. Unfortunately, this era didn't belong to him. Brando knew that he couldn't betray his thoughts. He couldn't help but have a headache. Why does House Cypher have this thing? What is it? An item of eternal indestructibility? Brando asked. However, Haku didn't seem to notice his absent-mindedness. He continued, "An item of eternal indestructibility? Of course not, although they do have some relationship with it. This lofty mountain language came from an item of eternal indestructibility. It's actually a broken fragment. These fragments were made into 6 gemstones, known as Cypher's Heart, and kept by the core members of the Cypher family for generations. Of these 6 diamonds, 3 have already been used, and the whereabouts of one are unknown. Right now, other than the one in your hand, there should only be one left in the hands of House Cypher. It should be in the hands of the legendary eldest son of the Emperor. Then how did House Cypher get them?" Brando asked. "You want to know?" Haku suddenly asked. "It's a very long story." "It doesn't matter." Brando thought that she was being perfunctory. He shook his head and replied, "We have plenty of time here." Haku paused. She suddenly said faintly, "I once knew a man named Erwin. His name was Villefort. He was a branch of House Cypher. During the chaos of Forza, his ancestors broke away from the current House Cypher. His ancestors brought their bloodline to the south to avoid the chaos. They settled down in today's Ranner area. He had a wife and a pretty good family. Villefort was a traveler. I got to know him during my travels. After going through a few trials and tribulations together, our relationship became close. Of course, that was a facade I deliberately made. I knew that he was a descendant of House Cypher, and had something to do with one of Cypher's hearts. That's why I took the initiative to get to know him." Haku narrated in a low voice, as if she was telling a distant story. "In order to gain his trust, I arranged a series of events to make him believe that he was targeted by an evil organization with the purpose of coveting one of House Cypher's inheritances and treasures. In fact, it was House Cypher's heart. Of course, it was inevitable that some people would die, but I didn't care. To me, those people were just ants. After thousands of years, I have long become cold and numb. Of course, this is not a derogatory comment to me. To be exact, I once thought it was a compliment. I hired men, and then killed them in the presence of Villefort, in order to gain his confidence. But I never lied to him, because they were killed by their own greed. Brando frowned. Although he could understand Haku's motives, he could not accept her way of doing things. This woman was even crazier than the Silver Queen, because everything Constance did in the end was under the influence of her own dark side. She had never deliberately pursued coldness and killing. She just chose what she thought was the most efficient way. Compared to her, Melissa's elder sister was a little unreasonable. I don't know if it's because 1,000 years is too long. Loneliness and stubbornness caused her to become like this. But the only thing he was thankful for was that at least this kind of character was not seen in Medisha. Haku did not care about Brando's opinion. She continued, "At the end of the plan I killed his wife but saved his 2 children. What?" Brando almost could not help but exclaim. "Why, do you have a problem with my way of doing things?" Haku's voice turned cold, and she asked lightly, "It's hard not to have a problem." Although he had a favor to ask, Brando did not intend to flatter this woman. "Then you can kill me to show your righteousness." I seem to have taken the wrong medicine. His words became a little sharp, and he said tit for tat. Brando shook his head. Although he was not used to it, he did not intend to become a messenger of justice. As long as Haku did not pose a threat to the people around him, he would not kill her. After all, she was Medisha's sister. Humph, hypocrite. Continue. Brando only said. This word made Haku fall silent for a moment, and then she continued. He loved his wife very much. His wife's death was a great blow to him, and during that time I was always by his side. Later, I replaced his wife's position and became the mother of his 2 children. Brando was stunned. For a moment he did not know how to evaluate the whole thing, but he finally understood Haku's tone at this moment. He could not help but ask in a gossipy manner, "You fell in love with him?" "Shut up." Bai Lung replied coldly, "This has nothing to do with you. What happened after that?" "After that, I finally found the opportunity to ask him about the heart of cipher he had, and I also got the answer I wanted from him. He loved me very much, just like how he loved his deceased wife. So when I found his necklace by accident, he didn't hide anything from me when I asked him about it. He told me everything about the necklace. According to him, the heart of cipher came from a place called Osopal, which is neither in Cruz nor in Erewhon. In fact, whether it really exists in Wonde is doubtful. Osopal actually means does not exist in the ancient language, and the heart of cipher came from there. They are one of the common fragments of an eternal object. These fragments were divided into 2, and one of them was made into 6 diamonds, called the Lofty Mountain language, or the heart of cipher. These 6 diamonds were actually brought out by 2 men. For some reason, they came into the hands of the Flame King Gretel, who then passed them to the ancestors of the House of Cipher, who brought them to Erewhon. They were brought to Erewhon. You should have some understanding of this land called the Land of Miracles. These 6 diamonds are obviously closely related to the whereabouts and ownership of the Flaming Blade. They are all to ensure that the inheritance of this holy sword is not lost. Haku replied. Actually, I seem to have heard of this person Villefort. Brando suddenly said. What? But I have a few questions, Miss Tiamas. What happened between you and him in the end? Did you take the heart of cipher with you? And you said that the fragment of the eternal object was divided into 2, so where did the remaining part go? Brando did not expect that his question would lead to such a long silence. After a long while, Haku finally replied quietly, Yes, sir. After I gave birth to 2 daughters for him, I killed him because I knew I had to leave. But I spared him and his deceased wife's children, and left the heart of cipher to his descendants. Brando had expected this answer, but he was still a little surprised. You didn't take the heart of cipher with you? I'm looking for the true eternal object, but the heart of cipher isn't. Although it's precious, it's not worth mentioning in my eyes. I've already gotten what I want, so I don't care about these things. The clue of the eternal object is related to the other half of the fragments, right? Chapter 1163. Haku nodded and revealed the answer to the riddle. Cipher's heart was originally a fragment of the artifact of eternity, but these fragments were split into 2. One of them was used to create these 6 gemstones, while the other half was lost. The lost fragments retained their original form, which was why they were still connected to the artifact of eternity to this day. Those fragments may reveal a secret. As long as I find them, they can lead me to Osapa, the legendary place. I believe that the relic of eternity is here, and I spent countless time confirming its existence little by little. After nearly 1,000 years of searching, I finally got the answer I wanted from the man Villefort. Haku ended his description with this paragraph. Brando sat on the shattered glacier. Cypher's heart had restored him to his original state, so his current condition was far better than when he was trekking in the snowfield. He could confirm that he was still in the trial world, but there was no biting cold wind under the glacier. Although the temperature was still very low, he was not in a hurry at the moment. He stood up and said to Haku, "Then let's go, Miss Tiamas." Haku stopped. "You haven't told me where this place is, and how do I get out of here and complete this trial?" Brando asked again. "This is the tile latch. You are walking the path once taken by the Knight of the Azure. This is the trial of the Chong Mountains. Of course, it is not as simple as it appears on the surface. At the end of these mountains there is an altar, and the azure lance was once inserted on that altar." The tile latch? Is it related to the tile latch of Wonde? Many of the names of Wonde come from myths, but it is also possible that the mountains did appear in Wonde a long time ago, just like the throne of Himalud. Haku replied. "So we have to find the altar?" "Naturally. Then what do I have to do?" "First, you have to go back to the ground. Can't we just follow this glacier?" Brando asked as he surveyed his surroundings. Although the space under the glacier was narrow, it was far less dangerous than walking on the glacier. The memory of the biting cold wind that could erode one's will was still fresh in his mind. Bai sneered. "Where do you think this place is? There are memories of nothingness under this glacier. Mortals will eventually lose themselves if they walk in here. You've been to the deadly frost forest, so you must have seen those nameless people. Is it that dangerous?" "It's just hearsay. If you don't believe me, you can try. Maybe there's another way out under the glacier." Brando could hear the sarcasm in Haku's tone, but he didn't intend to give it a try. He knew how dangerous it was to be in a place full of unknowns. Mortals didn't know much about this world. Anyone who looked down on it wouldn't have a good ending. He raised his head and looked up. Under the broken glacier, the ice layer was crisscrossed with cracks. Light and shadow shone through the layers of ice, making the whole underground a complicated maze. It was easier said than done to get back to the surface. Headache. Bai could naturally see that he was in trouble. "What can you do, Miss Tiamas? The problem is still with you. That little fairy told you what to do, but since you came here, you've forgotten other people's advice. To be honest, I've never seen a chosen as incompetent as you." Bai scorned. Being ridiculed like that, Brando was naturally annoyed. However, he knew that he couldn't argue with this woman at this time. Besides, what she said was definitely not nonsense. He tried to calm himself down and recalled what Lute said. "You mean here or within the range of the mountain of ceasing storms? Otherwise, where do you think it is? You're leading Abes into a warm little nest?" Probably because he didn't expect much from Brando's comprehension, Bai continued. "The Chong Mountain test is a test of willpower. Of course, it's not as easy here as in the mountain of ceasing storms. Whether it's the illusory ancient memories and whispers under the glacier, or the icy wind above the glacier that can freeze thoughts, they will all obstruct your thoughts. Unless your willpower is strong enough, you won't be able to get out of this glacier even if you walk for a lifetime. Do you think that the Knight of Azure spent 40 years here to travel and enjoy the scenery here? He honed his willpower in the icy wind, so he finally got the recognition of the mountains and found the only way to leave this place." Brando suddenly realized and couldn't help but feel ashamed of his ignorance. Since he transmigrated here from the Amber Sword, he had been relying too much on his understanding of the game. Once he encountered something that he didn't understand, he couldn't help but be at a loss. Come to think of it, Bai was right. With Lute's hint, he could have thought of a solution early on. But his performance now was worse than in the game. As a player in the upper middle class, he couldn't rely on his performance to stand up. Brendel was slightly alarmed. He had relied too much on his experience in the game, and had actually lost the most basic sense of vigilance and sensitivity to his surroundings. This was what he relied on the most in the game, and it was also one of the basic qualities of an expert player. Fortunately, his battle instincts were still there, and his skills had not returned. In fact, he had improved a lot in this world. Otherwise, with his current vigilance, it would have been difficult for him to survive the battle with Wuxia. Realizing that there was a problem, Brando quickly adjusted his attitude. He looked at the ice wall above his head and focused. As soon as he focused his attention, he immediately felt the difference in the world under the glacier. In the darkness that was originally empty below, there were some strange whispers echoing. These tiny voices seemed to drill into his mind from every pore. Brando was even sure that ordinary people wouldn't be able to help even if they covered their ears because these whispers appeared directly in their hearts. He immediately understood that these were the ancient memories and whispers that lurked in the darkness that Bai was talking about. He couldn't help but take a deep look in that direction. Although these whispers could only be heard by concentrating, if a mortal stayed down here for too long, they would inevitably be unconsciously influenced and eventually be tempted to fall into depravity. They would completely lose themselves and become the nameless people he saw in the deadly frost forest. Fortunately, Bai reminded him. Otherwise, if he wasn't vigilant, he might not have been willing to go back to the glacier. He might have unknowingly fallen into the trap. After thinking about this, the woman's mockery didn't sound so harsh. It was obvious that at least in terms of cooperation she didn't hold back. Of course, this could also be because Bai didn't want to die together with him. Brando looked up, and the crisscrossing world under the glacier became clear in his eyes. Although it wasn't as exaggerated as when Himalad's throne came directly in front of him in the stormy mountains, a clear path appeared in front of him at this moment. Not only him, even Bai couldn't help but praise when he saw this scene. No wonder they chose you. Although you are a little stupid, your will is rare. I'm afraid that even the Knight of the Azure Sky would be ashamed of his inferiority. Now I understand why you could wander aimlessly in the glacier for half a year without being blown to pieces by the Everwinter ice wind. In the ice wind, your strength and understanding of the laws are meaningless. Only your willpower can protect you from harm. Although you don't realize it, your willpower is too tough. It can protect you for such a long time even when you're unconscious. Bai's tone was full of incredulity. This is really unheard of. In theory, the toughness of a person's will is inseparable from the maturity of his mind. An idiot may not necessarily have a strong will. This can't be fate. Miss Tiamas, although I am far less scheming than you, I don't need to be described as such, right? Brando couldn't bear the lady's poisonous tongue and replied. I can't compare to your little princess. At most, I can be regarded as an ordinary person. You can't even compare to me. What do you think you are if not an idiot? Brando was speechless. After a long while, he asked, You mean Medisha? Of course, otherwise why do you think she is called the most talented commander of the Allied forces? She is the darling of the humans and elves. You must think that she is a gentle, elegant, and very easy to get along with princess, right? In fact, everyone thinks so because she is the same to everyone. However, the number of unlucky people who have died in her hands is much more than the number of people who have died in your hands. Bai was full of disdain. When your little princess sent her enemies in the court to guard the borders, your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather wasn't even born yet. But to be honest, I really like her in her current state. The last time in Abies was probably the only time in my life that I could teach her a lesson. If it wasn't because of this, do you think I would have given you the chance to act last time? When Bai talked about her sister, she was almost a completely different person from when she was recalling her past. Hearing this, Brando was shocked. However, he knew that this woman's one-sided words couldn't be fully believed. Perhaps Medisha had some tricks up her sleeve. After all, she was the commander of an army, not a simple and ignorant little girl. However, compared to her somewhat deranged sister, the former was obviously more trustworthy. At least this silver elf princess had never had any ill intentions towards her own people. Brando didn't respond to Bai's words. In fact, he had made up his mind to not offend either side. He wanted to get out of this strange glacier first. Who knew what was under the darkness? Although it was said that there were illusory ancient memories, these wandering memory fragments never existed alone, just like the dream of Hattie in the loop of trade winds. Oh! Chapter 1164. After making up his mind to ignore Haku, Brando grabbed the broken protrusions under the ice and carefully climbed up. Because he did not know how deep he had been swept into the ground by the avalanche, he did not know how long it would take him to see the surface. But after passing through a few sharp ice peaks, he suddenly remembered what Haku had said about the shards. He recalled what he had seen and heard in Haku's dream and suddenly asked, "So after that, you joined All for One for the other half of the shards?" "What?" "I mean the fragments of the other half of Cypher's heart. After you left Villefort, you should have been looking for them." Haku was silent. Brando understood her concern and replied, "Actually, you don't have to worry about it. I have no interest in the Relic of Eternity, but I am curious if such a thing really exists in this world. If you really don't want to say it, we can end this topic." "That's not necessary." Haku's voice sounded faintly. "I did join All for One for the sake of finding the fragments. After I left Villefort, I was looking for them. Later, by chance, I learned that All for One was also looking for these fragments. All for One is also looking for these fragments." Brando could not help but interrupt her. "Of course, I have my own methods and sources of information, which have almost never been wrong for nearly 1,000 years. It was through this method that I learned about the existence of Cypher's heart and found the Villefort family." When talking about her methods, Haku's voice sounded calm and confident. "But how can you be sure that they are not interested in Cypher's heart itself? Or are they interested in the Relic of Eternity? Because before I confirmed this information, decades ago in the north of Erewhon, they had used the Book of Mavacart to summon demons to destroy a duchy. At that time, this matter caused a shock throughout the continent. And when I traveled around the Silver Bay after leaving Villefort, I happened to be involved in the investigation because I was looking for the whereabouts of the Book of Mavacart. During the investigation, I found that the whole thing is not as simple as it seems. There are many suspicious points. So I tried to look up a lot of documents about this incident at the time. In these records, there were many places where it was mentioned that the members of All for One were obviously looking for a certain matter at the time. Unfortunately, these obvious clues were ignored by the Holy Sanctum's chroniclers. Bai's voice was filled with disdain. "I followed the clue and found out that they were looking for a fragment without much effort. At that time, I had just learned the truth about the fragment of the eternal indestructible item, so I naturally linked the two things together." "So you sneaked into All for One because of this. Did they find the fragment?" "I've experienced a lot of things in All for One. It took me about 15 years to get to the middle and upper levels of the organization, and there's no hope for me to go any higher. Although I have had plenty of time over the past 1,000 years, that is not the problem. This organization is far more organized than tree herders. I will not waste my time, so I have decided to take the risk." "What did you do?" "I spent 3 years waiting and another year preparing for this. Finally, I bribed an internal member to give me the opportunity to get close to the fragment. I knew that my chances of survival were not great, so I prepared the ritual of turning into the undead in advance. Later on, it proved that this matter was correct. In the process of escaping from All for One, I was seriously injured and relied on turning myself into the undead to escape. Moreover, All for One does not accept undead, so I could only escape to Madara to have a chance of survival. That happened about 30 years ago, and I lived in seclusion in Madara for 25 years to avoid the eyes of All for One. At that time, I got the fragment from them and took away a part of the Book of Mavacart." Bai's tone was flat, as if he was describing something that had nothing to do with him. Brando was secretly amazed. All for One was active in Wonde and had penetrated deeply into the world of order. Although their plans did not always succeed, it was rare to hear that they suffered losses. Bai not only infiltrated the organization, but also successfully mixed into the middle and upper levels. In terms of results alone, it was brilliant. There was no need to elaborate on what the Book of Mavacart meant to All for One. It took them so much effort to find the fragment that was related to the Relic of Eternity, so it was not something that could be casually discarded. This woman was calm and scheming, but when it was time to act, she was ruthless enough. If it was not for her paranoid style, Brando could not help but admire her. But at this time, he was more concerned about whether he was asking a tiger for its skin by cooperating with her. Bai seemed to have the ability to see through people's minds. She said contemptuously, "Why are you afraid?" "A little. No one wants to provoke a madman, let alone a madman with ability and means. I am no exception. Brando replied. I'll take it as a compliment. I'll accept it. Brando could only be speechless about some of the words and deeds of this woman. What about the fragment? If I remember correctly, you did not have it with you at that time, right? Brando suddenly remembered the situation of his battle with this woman in East Metz. He could not help but feel a little lucky. Fortunately, he had the advantage of understanding history at that time. Otherwise, he really did not know how he would have died. Of course I can't have it with me. All for One has not forgotten me. I know very well how those people do things. They are more vengeful than you think. Including you, you should be on their blacklist now. Don't forget how many times you have ruined their good deeds. Bai Lung laughed and said, that time in the deadly frost forest, the trouble you caused them was no less than the impact I caused when I stole the book of Mavacart and the fragment. I advise you to pay more attention to your territory. Who knows when they will give you a big gift. Brando frowned. He also knew a lot about All for One. Obviously, he understood that what Bai said might be true. However, he was also a little helpless about this matter. He could only counter soldiers with arms and water with an earth weir. In other words, this was called not worrying when there were too many debts. He had offended too many forces along the way. All for One tree herders the Empire Madara. As for the small characters like the royal faction and the northern nobles, they could now be ignored. Now there was another world boss, the Twilight Dragon. Compared to this one, the others were nothing. You left the fragment in Madara? He asked casually. You're asking too many questions, Bai replied mercilessly. Sorry, I just mentioned it casually, Brando replied. But I'm a little curious. Last time in East Metz, although you were nominally working for the Supreme One with the Mercury staff, in fact, your identity as the Patriarch of Tree Herders is more important. I'm curious about why you joined Tree Herders after that. Is it the same reason as All for One? Clever. Bai Lung replied coldly. But this time you guessed right. The reason I sneaked into Tree Herders was to find the fragment. I suspect that the Dragon Queen may have a fragment in her hands, but the time was too short, and I didn't have time to confirm it. I originally planned to spend the next few decades to confirm this matter, but I didn't expect to be disrupted by you. Damn it. You can't blame me for this. You were the one who made the first move. Brando's meaning was very simple. Bai Lung asked for it. That's not what I'm angry about. Bai snorted softly. I'm angry that I actually failed in your hands and ruined my reputation. Especially after that, your behavior was so unsightly. If you dare to reveal this experience in the future, I'll fight you to the death. Brando was speechless, especially when he thought about why this woman had been searching outside for the past 1,000 years. He felt that her last sentence might not be just a threat. For a paranoid person, her behavior could not be judged by common sense. All right. Bai suddenly reacted. I suddenly remembered something. You still owe me something. What did you say? Brando was stunned. He originally thought that this woman was just paranoid, but at least she was reasonable. He did not expect her to slap him in the face in the blink of an eye. He couldn't figure out how he could owe her anything. Back then, when she perished with him, he didn't get any spoils of war. If she wanted to put her losses on him, it would be too ridiculous. Moreover, if that was the case, it wouldn't just be one thing. If I'm not wrong, you should still owe me a fragment. Oh. Brando's hand slipped and he almost fell down from the crack of the glacier. Fortunately, he had the strength in the game now. After sliding down a few dozen feet, he forcefully inserted his hand into the glacier to stop the downward trend. Then he said angrily, I don't think this joke is funny at all, Miss Tiamas. This is not a joke. Let me ask you, did you save a little girl at Fathom Port? Bai did not care about his words and asked seriously. Brando was stunned and then nodded. Yet, that was the daughter of the flower leaf caller. Her name is... I'm not interested in her name, Bai interrupted him. At that time, she was escorted by a team of Imperial Knights. There was a noble among them. What was his name? Rodney, he's Veronica's younger brother. Brendel remembered this person clearly because of Veronica's relationship with him. I don't care whose brother he is. You. Brando was suddenly speechless. He began to feel that it was a very painful thing to talk to this unreasonable woman. This person is one of my men, Bai said. You should have locked them up, right? Did you search their bodies and get a fragment from them? Of course not, Brando replied subconsciously. At that time the war was imminent. He did not have the time to collect some strange fragments. Moreover, he did not even know the existence of this thing at that time. But just as he spoke he could not help but freeze. Bai noticed his tone and could not help but gloat. What's wrong? Can't say anything? Brando was not in the mood to pay attention to her, because he suddenly remembered that there seemed to be such a thing at that time, and it almost caused a big trouble. But that thing, he did not only have one fragment. Chapter 1165. Did you really get it? Haku asked. Seeing Brando's strange expression, she had a 70 to 80% guess in her heart. That shard is the main reason I'm heading to the Kurlutz Empire's eastern Metz region, or else the black orb alone wouldn't be enough to make me move. I'm not safe anywhere outside of Madara. The spies of the Unifying Guild are everywhere. After confirming this, the woman's voice calmed down and explained. After listening to her words, Brando understood. He grasped the crack of the glacier firmly and climbed back to his previous position. At the same time, he calmed himself down from the previous shock. It had to be said that under the stimulation of this woman, he seemed to have regained the sharpness that originally belonged to the game. After carefully analyzing the pros and cons, he asked, You want to get this fragment from me? Haku hurriedly said, No, it's an exchange. I can pay you a satisfactory price. Anyway, you are not interested in the Relic of Eternity. But now Brando's thoughts had changed. He shook his head and said, It's impossible for anyone not to be interested in the Relic of Eternity. I only said this before because I'm different from you, Miss Tiamas. You can take away things that don't belong to you by any means, but I can't because I don't think there's anything more important in this world than upholding principles. And in fact, I want to remind you that the Relic of Eternity doesn't belong to you, and it hasn't been engraved with a person's name. Haku closed her mouth. Of course she thought this was a kind of bargaining because it was her own nature. You mean to say that you want me to raise the price? It doesn't matter, I don't care. You can ask for anything you want. These words made Brando raise his eyebrows. He really couldn't stand this woman's logic and finally couldn't help but mock. Then give you to me. A chill rose from Brando's back. You're playing with fire. Haku's voice suddenly became a few degrees colder. That's impossible. I'm the princess of the Empire, not Lei Feng. Other than that. That's why don't make promises that you can't keep. Besides, what you said before is not quite the same as what you are saying now. I have not forgotten poor M. de Villefort, and perhaps you would have considered his feelings before making your statement. Damn it, shut up. Bai was infuriated. I don't want to talk about this. If you want to make a deal with me, don't try to provoke me. Don't think that I have to get that fragment from you. But Brando didn't care about this threat at all. He calmly replied, That's exactly what I wanted to say, Miss Tiamas. There was a long period of silence between the two of them. Brando was overjoyed when he saw an ice crevice that was wide enough for one person to pass through. Climbing in such a place was much easier than climbing on a glacier. He subconsciously increased his speed. Not long after he sped up, a bright light appeared above the ice crevice. The light shone down from the ice, forming a long, magnificent tunnel that stretched for about a few miles. Seeing this, Brando knew that they were very close to the ground. The light could only come from the ice sheet, which meant that the ice was quite thin in this place. But how Ren's silence finally made Haku unable to hold on. What's your condition? She had to take the initiative to speak. Her voice was a little hoarse, as if it was not coming from the same person. She seemed to be suffering. Thousands of years of searching for the Relic of Eternity had almost become an obsession for her, and this idea even made her a little paranoid and crazy. Of course, Bai Long said coldly, except for that one condition. Which one? Brando sneered. You know, you bastard. Brando shook his head, knowing that he had finally taken back the initiative. It was not difficult, and it was not because he was smarter than Haku, but because he knew that he had the absolute initiative in this conversation. Haku could not do anything to him, and even needed his help. If she could not take the lead in the conversation, then he would be a failure. Previously, he did not argue with Haku because she was Medish's sister, but the main reason was that there was no conflict of interest between the two of them. But now it was different. Brando knew very well that if he could not take the initiative in the next conversation, some of his ideas could not be realized. As for the fragments, he was also determined to get them. You still don't quite understand what I mean, Miss Tiamas. He took the initiative to remind Haku. I'm telling you this not because I want to insult you, but because I want to tell you that our positions in this transaction are equal. Of course, I have more resources, and it's you who want to get something from me. I can choose not to accept your proposal, so don't take everything for granted. He continued, You are Medicia's sister, the princess of the Silver Elves, but unfortunately, you are a human. Your identity does not have any binding force on me, so in terms of position we are also equal, do you understand? Haku was silent, but Brando knew that her silence was actually a tacit agreement. However, he did not take the initiative to speak, but instead, he sped up and climbed to the surface. The bottom of the glacier was getting brighter, and the surrounding ice layer had changed from the previous blue to the current light blue, and was gradually evolving into a colorless and transparent direction. After a while, Haku's voice sounded again, and she still asked in a hoarse voice, What do you want? Although the question was almost exactly the same as before, the meaning behind it was completely different. This Silver Elf Queen was no idiot. Her several hundred years of experience had proven this point. Perhaps she was a little stubborn, but she definitely wasn't stupid. She knew that Brando was not talking to her about principles and equality, but about his own conditions. These words only meant one thing, and that was that if she wanted to get that thing, she had to follow his wishes. Her question was actually already a compromise. Brando nodded. Let's talk about the fragments again. You said that Tumen brought them out from a place called Osopal, he asked. Is this a legend or is it true? It is true. You heard it from Villefort. Do you have any other evidence to prove it? When I was hiding in All for One, I found some information that can confirm this. Tumen had been to this place before, but as to whether it was by chance or because of Odin's instructions, I don't know. Brando was silent, and although the speed of his hands and feet did not slow down at all, and he was still climbing rapidly to the surface, he had already believed Haku's words in his heart. In history, there was a place called Osopal in the wilderness of the Four Territories, where the Myurnas, the Silver Folk, and the humans had a great battle, and Tumen was said to have died in that battle. The place where Osopal used to be was the area of today's Land of Dusk, but like the final battlefield, people could no longer find the ancient battlefield. Such things were not uncommon in Wonde. Many places in Wonde were between the physical world and the world of laws, such as Himelad's throne and the Latch of Wa where they were now. They themselves were a kind of law, or the manifestation of God's kingdom on the ground, and may never appear again for some reason. However, Brando remembered that Tumen had once given him a treasure map, and that treasure map was buried deep in his mind, and he could only vaguely remember some details. Tumen had said that when his strength reached a certain level, he would be able to understand what was described on the treasure map, but now that he was already a supreme existence, he still knew little about the treasure map. When Braggs was sorting out the relics of Ondina's father, he had obtained a hand-drawn map from the relics and letters left behind by him. At that time, he found that the map was similar to the treasure map left by Tumen in his memory, and the ciphertext on the map was marked with the name Osopal. These clues happened to coincide with what Haku had said. When Haku mentioned Villefort before, Brando felt that the name was somewhat familiar. He vaguely remembered that when Ondina was talking about her family, she had mentioned this name, and it seemed that he was from the generation of her grandfather's father. And Ondina did indeed move from Ranner to Braggs when her father's generation fell. Of course, although it could be a coincidence or someone with the same name, after all, the name Villefort was considered common in Erewhon, and it was not a rare or uncommon name. But the name Villefort was closely related to Cypher's heart, the relic of eternal indestructibility, and the name Osopal. It was obviously not a coincidence that such a map was found in Ondina's father's relics. Besides, Brando also remembered another thing. When he found Borgnessen's corpse in the Forbidden Orchard, one of the fragments was found next to the corpse. All the evidence pointed to one truth, and that was that Villefort was very likely Ondina's ancestor. One of the children of Haku's deceased wife was Ondina's grandfather. Ondina was a descendant of the Cypher royal family? A possibility that made Brando feel a little cold flash through his mind. He suddenly remembered why the necklace that Chiara gave him looked so familiar. Oh! Chapter 1166. Did you really get it? Haku asked. Seeing Brando's strange expression, she had a 70 to 80% guess in her heart. That fragment is my main purpose for going to the East Mets of the Cruz Empire. Otherwise, the black orb alone would not be enough to make me move. I'm not safe outside of Madara. All for one spies are everywhere. After confirming this, the woman's voice calmed down and explained. After listening to her words, Brando understood. He grasped the crack of the glacier firmly and climbed back to his previous position. At the same time, he calmed himself down from the previous shock. It had to be said that under the stimulation of this woman, he seemed to have regained the sharpness that originally belonged to the game. After carefully analyzing the pros and cons, he asked, "You want to get this fragment from me?" Haku hurriedly said, "No, it's an exchange. I can pay you a satisfactory price. Anyway, you are not interested in the Relic of Eternity." But now Brando's thoughts had changed. He shook his head and said, "It's impossible for anyone not to be interested in the Relic of Eternity. I only said this before because I'm different from you, Miss Tiamas. You can take away things that don't belong to you by any means, but I can't because I don't think there's anything more important in this world than upholding principles. And in fact, I want to remind you that the Relic of Eternity doesn't belong to you, and it hasn't been engraved with a person's name." Haku closed her mouth. Of course she thought this was a kind of bargaining because it was her own nature. "You mean to say that you want me to raise the price? It doesn't matter, I don't care. You can ask for anything you want." These words made Brando raise his eyebrows. He really couldn't stand this woman's logic and finally couldn't help but mock. "Then give you to me." A chill rose from Brando's back. "You're playing with fire." Haku's voice suddenly became a few degrees colder. "That's impossible. I'm the princess of the empire, not Lei Feng. Other than that. That's why don't make promises that you can't keep. Besides, what you said before is not quite the same as what you are saying now. I have not forgotten poor M. de Villefort, and perhaps you would have considered his feelings before making your statement." "Damn it, shut up." Bai was infuriated. "I don't want to talk about this. If you want to make a deal with me, don't try to provoke me. Don't think that I have to get that fragment from you." But Brando didn't care about this threat at all. He calmly replied, "That's exactly what I wanted to say, Miss Tiamas." What followed was a long period of silence between the two. Brando was overjoyed when he saw an ice crevice in front of him that could only fit one person at a time. Climbing in this place was much easier than climbing on a glacier. He subconsciously increased the speed of his ascent. Not long after he sped up, a bright band of light appeared above the ice crevice. The light shone down from the ice, forming a long, magnificent tunnel that stretched for about a few miles. Seeing this, Brando knew that they were very close to the ground. The light could only come from the ice sheet, which meant that the ice was quite thin in this place. But his silence finally made Haku unable to hold on any longer. "What's your condition?" She had to take the initiative to speak. Her voice was a little hoarse, as if it was not coming from the same person. She seemed to be suffering. Thousands of years of searching for the Relic of Eternity had almost become an obsession for her, and this idea even made her a little paranoid and crazy. "Of course," Bai Lung said coldly, "except for that condition." "Which one?" Brando sneered. "You know, you bastard." Brando shook his head, knowing that he had finally taken back the initiative. It was not difficult, and it was not because he was smarter than Haku, but because he knew that he had the absolute initiative in this conversation. Haku could not do anything to him, and even needed his help. If she still could not take the lead in the conversation, then he would be a failure. Previously, he did not argue with Haku because she was Medish's sister, but the main reason was that there was no conflict of interest between the two of them. But now it was different. Brando knew very well that if he could not take the initiative in the next conversation, then some of his ideas could not be realized. As for those fragments, he was also determined to get them. "You still don't quite understand what I mean, Miss Tiamas." He took the initiative to remind Haku. "I'm telling you this not because I want to insult you, but because I want to tell you that our positions in this transaction are equal. Of course I have more resources, and it's you who want to get something from me. I can choose not to accept your proposal, so don't take everything for granted." He continued, "You are Medish's sister, the princess of the Silver Elves, But unfortunately, you are a human. Your identity does not have any binding force on me, so in terms of position we are also equal, do you understand? Haku was silent, but Brando knew that her silence was actually a tacit agreement. But he did not take the initiative to speak, and instead, he sped up and climbed to the surface. The bottom of the glacier was getting brighter, and the surrounding ice had turned from a faint blue to a light blue, and was gradually evolving into a colorless and transparent direction. After a while, Haku's voice sounded again, and she still asked with a somewhat hoarse voice, "What do you want?" Although the question was almost exactly the same as before, the meaning behind it was completely different. This silver elf queen was no idiot. Her several hundred years of experience had proven this point. Perhaps she was a little stubborn, but she definitely wasn't stupid. She understood that Brando was not talking to her about principles and equality, but about his own conditions. These words only meant one thing, and that was that if she wanted to get that thing, she had to follow his wishes. Her question was actually a kind of compromise. Brando nodded. "Let's talk about those fragments again. You said that Tumen brought them out from a place called Osopal," he asked. "Is this a legend or is it true?" "It is true. You heard it from Villefort. Do you have any other evidence to prove it?" "When I was hiding in All for One, I found some information that can confirm this. Tumen had been to this place before, and as for whether it was by chance or because of Odin's instructions, I don't know." Brando fell silent, and although the speed of his hands and feet did not slow down at all, and he was still climbing rapidly to the surface, he had already believed Haku's words in his heart. In history, there was a place called Osopal in the wilderness of the Four Territories, where the Myurnas, the Silver Folk, and the humans had a great battle, and Tumen was said to have died in that battle. The place where Osopal used to be was the area of today's Land of Dusk, but like the final battlefield, people could no longer find the ancient battlefield. This kind of thing was not uncommon in Wonde. Many places in Wonde were between the physical world and the world of laws, such as Himelad's throne and the Latch of Wa where they were now. They were a kind of law in themselves, or the manifestation of the kingdom of God on the ground, and may not appear again for some reason. However, Brando remembered that Tumen had once given him a treasure map, and that treasure map was buried deep in his mind, and he could only vaguely remember some details. Tumen said that when his strength reached a certain level, he would be able to understand the things described on the treasure map, but now that he was a supreme being, he still had a smattering of understanding of the treasure map. When Braggs was sorting out the relics of Amandina's father, he had obtained a hand-drawn map from the relics and letters left behind by him. At that time, he found that the map was similar to the treasure map left by Tumen in his memory, and the ciphertext on the map was marked with the name Osopal. These clues happened to coincide with what Haku had said. When Haku mentioned Villefort before, Brando felt that the name was somewhat familiar. He vaguely remembered that when Amandina was talking about her family, she had mentioned this name, and it seemed that he was from the generation of her grandfather's father. Amandina did indeed move from Ranner to Braggs when her father's generation fell. Of course, although it could be a coincidence or someone with the same name, after all, the name Villefort was considered common in Erewhon, and it was not a rare or uncommon name. However, the name Villefort was closely related to Cypher's heart, the relic of eternity, and the name Osopal. It was obviously not a coincidence that such a map was found in Amandina's father's relics. Besides, Brando also remembered another thing. When he found Borgnessen's corpse in the Forbidden Orchard, one of the fragments was found next to the corpse. All the evidence pointed to the truth, and that was that Villefort was very likely Amandina's ancestor. One of the children of Haku's deceased wife was Amandina's grandfather. Amandina was a descendant of the Cypher royal family? Brando felt a chill run down his spine, and he suddenly remembered why the necklace that Chiara gave him looked so familiar. Oh! Chapter 1167. He had seen the same necklace on Amandina's body, but there was no pendant on the necklace. Amandina said that it was a relic left behind by her father. During the Battle of Ampere Seal, Amandina unexpectedly came back from the dead. He had thought that he was hallucinating, but now that he thought about it, everything was clear now. Brando was speechless for a moment. "Oh, Count Brendel, the lady beside you." Terst's words from the night in Amandina's old house still rang in his ears. He remembered that when he first met Amandina, the bandits that he and Badam took care of claimed that Amandina's father owed them money. Amandina denied it at that time. Brando knew her better than anyone. Amandina would never lie, so there was something fishy behind this matter. Now that I think about it, Terst is a member of All for One. If Amandina is a descendant of Cypher's royal family and has Cypher's heart on her, and she might be related to the fragment of the eternal relic, then the reason why All for One is looking for trouble with a poor noble's daughter is obvious. But Amandina obviously knows about the power of Cypher's heart. Otherwise, she wouldn't have lied to me after the Battle of Ampere Seal. How much does she know about her bloodline? Why didn't she tell us about it? He thought that he knew Amandina well, but now he wasn't sure. Why are you spacing out? Haku was getting impatient when Brando was spacing out. She realized that she wasn't afraid of Brando's threats. Instead, she was worried that he wouldn't say anything because she couldn't guess what he was thinking. Brando stopped. He had already climbed to the top of the ice cliff. There was a narrow crack above his head, and he could see the gloomy sky from above. The ground was almost within reach. He took a deep breath and continued forward while holding onto the cold wall. He answered Haku's question. Do you know what kind of place Osopal is, Lady Tiamas? How would I know? I've been to the wilderness of 4 territories and was almost discovered by the spies of All for One. But that place used to be called Osopal is now just a small hill. There's nothing there. Then I have a suggestion, Brando said. You want the Relic of Eternity, but I'm interested in this place. If you can gather all the fragments, I'll go with you. Don't. Haku replied very vigilantly. You're pushing your luck. I want the Relic of Eternity, and I won't allow any unstable factors. I said the Relic of Eternity doesn't belong to anyone for the time being. Don't treat it as something that belongs to you. If I don't agree, you'll never get it. Brando didn't care about Haku's rejection and replied coldly, but if you agree, you can at least bet that I'm really not interested in the Relic of Eternity. Aren't you doing that now? You're not even afraid that your life is in my hands, so why would you be afraid that I'll break my promise? Haku was silent. She actually understood that Brando's words made sense, but it was a difficult choice for her. She was a person with a strong desire for control. She could easily give up her own life just like how she didn't care about the lives of others. But she had a strong sense of purpose, and she would not allow the plan to develop in a direction that she couldn't control. Brando pretended to be indifferent, although he was very curious about the gift that Tumen left for him. Besides, there might be more important secrets behind this treasure. Whether it was the origin of Amandina or the abnormality caused by the gray stone pieces in Fathom Harbor. He still couldn't forget the scene at that time. It was clearly the will of the Twilight Dragon that descended from outside the elemental barrier. How could a fragment that could alarm an existence of this level be taken lightly? However, he didn't show this attitude. He only walked along the small radial path between the glaciers. Soon, bright light filled his vision, causing him to almost squint his eyes. His vision was filled with white glaciers and snowy plains. This was almost a nightmare to him before, but after experiencing the darkness of the underground, he felt somewhat familiar with it now. At this time, Haku finally spoke. Then you have to do your part. How do I do my part? Brando asked as he looked around. In addition to the Dragon Queen and 1 fragment in your hand, there should be 4 more fragments. Among the remaining 4 fragments, we will each take 2 and investigate separately. You have to use your power. You are a noble of Erewhon, a close vassal of the Regent Princess, and also helped Cruz's eldest son to seize the throne. You already have a lot of power in the mortal world. I believe you can give me a satisfactory answer. Brendel did not comment on Haku's condition. He thought for a while and changed the question. I have one last question. Is this the shard you're talking about? As he spoke, he took out the gray stone piece from the floating celestial sphere. It was about the size of a palm. It was a gray flat stone piece that looked like a chisel. There were no traces of artificial carvings on its surface, as if it was naturally peeled off from a huge rock. But at this moment, this stone piece was covered with all kinds of runes and secret runes, as if it was wrapped in all kinds of seals. It lay quietly on Brando's hand, and no aura could be felt from it. Clumsy seal, Haku said disdainfully. This is the fragment you found from the night? She wanted to say a few more words because the stone should have belonged to her. She had spent a lot of effort to find it and secretly took it from the hands of its original owner. But she did not expect it to fall into Brendel's hands because of her negligence. However, as soon as she opened her mouth, she was stunned, and all the words she wanted to say were stuck in her stomach, because she saw Brando take out another similar fragment. "Do you think this is the same?" Brando asked. "Or is it a counterfeit?" In fact, he already knew the answer in his heart. These fragments were most likely real. Otherwise, they would not have been able to trigger the mutation at Fatan Port. But for safety reasons, he still wanted to confirm it. "How did you get this thing?" Haku was so surprised that she almost cried out. "Where did you get it? I understand now. That little girl, I should have known that she was the descendant of that bitch. Villefort, that bastard, really hid something from me." Brando heard the indignation and anger in her voice and could not help but shake his head. He thought to himself, "You killed them all. Who is the one who should blame whom?" And Villefort might not have been hiding something, because he suspected that Amandina's father was involved in this series of events because he was investigating what happened to his grandfather. He just did not know how his grandfather, who appeared and disappeared mysteriously, was connected to this place called Osopio. Amandina once said that her father had been collecting stone pieces when he was alive. At that time, he also left some of these stone pieces among the relics he left for Amandina. They were very different from the fragments mentioned by Haku, but they were similar in some ways. At least in terms of appearance, they were very similar. Unfortunately, when he checked the stone pieces at that time, he found that they were just some very ordinary sandstone pieces, so he gave them to Amandina for safekeeping. He did not have them with him at the moment, otherwise he could have taken them to Haku to check. Maybe there would be some clues. Borg Nesson obviously knew some of the secrets of his family. He had been searching for relevant information for a long time. Although his goal was not to obtain the Relic of Eternity, but to find another secret, it was a pity that when he finally found the fragment of the real Relic of Eternity, he had reached the end of his life. "If I didn't have the memories and experience from my previous life, I'm afraid the secrets of my body would have been lost in the long river of history." He was still thinking about this problem when he heard Haku continue to ask nervously, "How many fragments do you have? Are you lying to me? You knew this secret long ago?" No, Brando shook his head and said. "You can rest assured that I did not know this secret until now. But how many fragments I have has nothing to do with you. You just have to fulfill your obligations, and our cooperation is still valid." "I want the Relic of Eternity," Haku replied, gnashing his teeth. "That's yours. I can give you this promise." Only then did Haku shut his mouth. Brando ignored him. He looked up and tried to find a path in the snowfield, but it was at this time that both of them saw an invisible ripple spreading in the gloomy sky. Then, a rumbling sound came from the horizon. It was as if thunder was rolling from the distant horizon. "What is that?" Brando asked. "That's a sign that the space somewhere is becoming unstable." Haku's voice was slightly uneasy. "The avalanche earlier should be caused by it. There might be some changes in the wind elemental plane outside. I suggest you speed up because I don't know if this change is good or bad." Brando did not reply, but he felt that it might not be that simple. He had a faint premonition that the change might not be in the wind elemental plane, but in the entire elemental barrier. P.S. Yesterday when I was writing the title of the chapter, I subconsciously wrote 70 after 60. That's not a big deal and there's nothing wrong with my mathematics. Actually, thinking about it carefully, it's all Jianyang's fault because Jianyang did not let me change the title of the chapter. Yes, that must be it.